The first thing he felt was a rock, wet and cold. His cheek rested on it as if on ice. Laughter came from above and from all sides at once. He opened his eyes and saw boots. Lots of boots. Leather, rough, and worn. People stood in a circle, looking down at him. His mouth tasted of ash. His right forearm burned so badly that the bone beneath the flesh felt red hot. He raised his arm and saw the brand, a copper circle with 4 prongs. A fresh burn. The skin around it was swollen and glistening. He didn't remember how he'd ended up here. He didn't remember this courtyard, these walls, or this sky the color of wet ash. But his body remembered. His body knew to stand up straight when the brand was being read. He got down on his knees and then to his feet. The courtyard was paved with gray stone and surrounded by a wall 3 men tall. The order's copper seal hung above the gate. In the city of Tarnhall, branding took place once a year, and everyone who had turned 17 was branded. Each person received a line. That line determined everything else. Before him on the dais stood a man in a gray cloak with a copper chain across his chest. Assessor Oswin Kryl. Thin and tall, with the face of a man who had spent 30 years reading others' fates aloud and had grown weary of each one. He held a scroll in his hands and looked at Dargan's brand, a look of something resembling interest on his face. The crowd fell silent. Kryl read the first line. He announced that Dargan Holt had been granted the class of necromancer. The courtyard exhaled in unison. A necromancer appeared once in every 1,100 brandings. In 30 years in Tarnhall, there had been 2 such individuals. Both had served in the order, and both had dined from silver. Dargan looked at his forearm, and something very old and very familiar stirred inside him. He didn't know this city, but he knew what happens when you're given a good tool. With a good tool, always comes a price. Kryl read the second line. He read it slowly and distinctly because he wanted those in the back row to hear it. Strength 8, endurance 9, dexterity 7, will 6, intelligence 0. The silence lasted exactly 1 heartbeat. Then the courtyard erupted. Everyone was laughing, the scribes by the wall, the apprentices at the gate, the women with their baskets, and the guards on the platform. A necromancer draws power from wisdom. Every spell is paid for with wisdom, like a coin. With a wisdom of 12, you can raise a carrion eater. With a wisdom of 30, you can raise a human. With a wisdom of 0, you can't raise anything. 0 meant that the city's rarest class had gone to a sack of meat that couldn't even revive a dead rat. Oswin Kryl rolled up the scroll and said that the order does not waste its stipend on empty vessels. He announced that the 30 crowns of annual support and a place at the Copper School would be passed on to the next person on the list. Dargan watched as the scribe crossed his name out of the book. A single line in ink. Everything he had vanished in the time it took to draw that line. Kryl said one more thing. He reminded them of the law. Every branded person is required to pass the first trial within 40 days. Those who fail are deemed a burden on the city. Burdens are sold to the bone pits beyond the wall. There, their bones are crushed and boiled down into glue and fertilizer. There is no ransom from there. Kryl said he was giving him a full 40 days out of mercy, and he added that he advised him to spend them in prayer. The crowd laughed again. A young man in a blue tunic with silver trim stepped forward from the front row. Raymond Hess, the son of a tax collector. His roll had been read an hour earlier, and he'd been assigned the Blade class and a dexterity score of 21. He stepped right up close, looked Dargan in the eye, and then tossed a copper coin at his feet. He said it would be enough for a shovel. He said the dead needed a man who knew how to dig, not lift. The courtyard roared. Dargan stared at the copper coin on the wet stone. He didn't pick it up. He turned and walked toward the gate, and the crowd parted before him, not out of respect, but because no one wanted to stand next to a burden. Beyond the gate lay the city, narrow streets, gutters running down the middle of the pavement, and the smell of fish and peat smoke. He walked and counted. He wasn't counting money. There was no money. He was counting weight. 8 units of strength is about as much as a strong porter can lift. 9 units of stamina is how much he can bear on his shoulders before his spine cracks. He didn't know where this knowledge came from, and he didn't bother to find out. It just lay in his head the way an old tool lies in a drawer. Strength isn't about muscle. Strength is a fulcrum, the right angle, and an accurate calculation of the load. Anyone who doesn't understand this breaks their back on the very first lift. By evening, he'd visited 6 places where he could spend the night for free, and he'd been kicked out of all 6. The mark was visible. The necromancer's mark scared people away more than a thief's mark. People were afraid he'd bring the dead with him. No one believed he couldn't even lift a rat. They only believed they had to stay as far away from him as possible. There was only one place left that would take anyone in: the ossuary beneath Tarn Hall. The city stood on old terraces, and beneath it lay the bones of everyone who had died there over the past 400 years. They were stored in underground galleries. It was the law, and it made economic sense because land above ground was expensive. The entrance was by the eastern wall, a rusty grate 10 steps down, and the smell of dry dust that clogged your throat and lingered there for a long time. Inside, it was dark, dry, and almost warm. The bones lay in layers all the way to the ceiling. Thigh bones next to thigh bones, skulls next to skulls, ribs in separate bundles. Dargan sat down by the wall and looked at them, and in his mind there was neither fear nor awe. There was only one very simple thought. There is a great deal of durable material lying here, and no one needs this material. He reached out toward the nearest pile and did the one thing his class knew how to do: lift. The spell was as natural to him as breathing. It didn't even require words. It required the mind. He pulled, and nothing happened. He pulled harder and felt something in his head hit a brick wall. Not fatigue, a void. Where others had a tool, he had emptiness. He tried 9 more times. On the 9th try, a single small phalanx in the pile twitched and turned a quarter turn. And that was it. That was the extent of his rare talent. He sat in the darkness and stared at the dead man's finger, which had twitched only because the necromancer of Tarn Hall had strained so hard his ears rang. And then he did what anyone does when their tool isn't working. He took it in his hands. He simply reached out and gripped the nearest femur, tightly, just as one would grip a handle, and the brand on his forearm flared up. It didn't hurt. It literally flared up from within. The bone beneath his fingers quivered and began to flow. It didn't soften. It ran down his arm like water down a gutter, encircling his forearm from elbow to wrist, and solidified. Dargan sat motionless. A bone cuff was now on his arm. Solid. No seams. He tried to unclench his fingers, but the cuff remained. He tried to strike the wall with his hand, and the wall cracked. A line from the brand appeared before his eyes. It burned in the darkness right in front of his face. The bone's grip. The bone does not obey the voice. The bone obeys the grip. He read it 3 times. It was all in those 2 phrases. A spell requires reason. A grip requires nothing but a hand. A necromancer with 0 reason cannot command, but anyone can take. The line was replaced by a second one. Carrying limit. For every point of endurance, the body can hold 1 pound of bone. Endurance 9. Carrying capacity 9 pounds. Overload breaks the carrier. He weighed the bracelet in his mind. 4 pounds. That means 5 more. And then came the third, not a line, a sensation. The hand beneath the bracelet began to freeze. Not the way you freeze in the cold, from the inside, as if heat were being slowly drawn from the flesh, flowing into the bone and vanishing there. He breathed on his fingers and felt no warmth. The skin was still there, but there was no warmth in it. He understood the price before the brand had a chance to name it. Every bone taken from the body drains the carrier's warmth. He sat with that thought for a moment. Then he smiled into the darkness. He thought it was a fair deal. He'd seen people pay more for less. He stood up and walked over to the rusty grate blocking the side gallery. The lock was fist-sized. He took it in his bony palm and squeezed. The metal crumpled like tin. He looked at his hand and recalled a number. Strength 8. With an 8, a lock like this wouldn't hold. That meant the gauntlet provided more than just protection. It provided weight, leverage, and a fulcrum. And at that moment, the last line of the evening flashed before his eyes. Hidden branch discovered. Bone berserker. Requirement. Strength 15. Branch closed. He had 3 free brand points. 3 points is what you get during your first branding so a novice can tweak their build. Anyone in his place would have put them into intelligence. With 3 intelligence points, he could have raised a rat. With 6, in a year's time, he could have raised a dog. In 10 years, he would have become a mediocre necromancer relegated to the 3rd row. Dargan looked at the cracked wall and the crumpled lock and did the math. He wasn't counting the years. He was calculating the load. Anyone who places a weak support under a heavy beam kills not only themselves. They kill everyone standing below. He knew this very well and didn't want to remember where he'd learned it. He put all 3 points into strength. Strength 11. The brand on his forearm darkened to the color of old copper. The bracelet on his wrist grew tighter. He struck the wall again, and this time a chunk the size of his palm broke off. He picked it up, weighed it in his hand, and thought that he had 4 points left until he reached 15, and that points were awarded for checks, for creatures killed, and for work that no one else would take on. He sat back down against the wall and began sorting through the nearest pile. Not as a sacred object, as a warehouse. The thigh bones went to the lever. The lamp didn't move. Dargan slowly stood up, and the bone bracelet on his right wrist glinted faintly in the darkness. He didn't bother to hide it. It was too late to hide it. An old man stepped out from behind the lamp. He was short and hunched over, with his left sleeve tied to his belt. His arm was missing from the shoulder down. He shuffled over, stopped 3 paces away, and stared at the bracelet for a long time, then at the wall with the chip section. He said he'd been watching for 2 hours already. He said that in 40 years of service, he'd seen everything in this gallery. Drunks, thieves, 3 real necromancers from the Order, and not a single one of them had touched a bone with their hands. He introduced himself as Vesper Gald and said he was the keeper of the ossuary and that, by law, everything lying here belonged to the city. He explained that taking even a single bone away was punishable by a year of hard labor. For a wrist bone, the penalty is 3 years. Dargan listened and didn't move. He looked the old man in the face and saw not anger, but calculation. Vesper said he could call the guards right now, and immediately added that he wouldn't. He explained why. The lower level of the ossuary had been flooded 4 years ago when an old water pipe burst. The water receded after a month, but what remained down there was no longer bone. It was moving. The Order sealed off the lower level with a grate, and declared it a third-level danger zone. Since then, 4 squads had gone down there, and only 7 out of 26 had returned. Vesper said that every month he writes a petition, and every month he receives a refusal, because cleaning out the lower level costs more than the Bone House's entire income for 3 years. And he spoke plainly. He proposed a deal. Dargan would go down there. Whatever he broke down there, he could keep for himself. Vesper would turn a blind eye to any bones he brought back up. Dargan asked what the catch was. Vesper replied that the catch was that his son lay down there. He'd gone down with the 3rd squad 11 years ago. Vesper said he wasn't asking for the body. He was asking for a copper token marked with the number 214. Dargan was silent. He wasn't thinking about the token or his son. He was thinking about the number. 26 people went in and 7 came out. That gave them a ratio of nearly 3-to-1 against him. He was thinking that there were 39 days left until the test, and that during those days he needed to gather 4 power points from the air. They were down there. They weren't up here. He agreed. Vesper took the key from his belt and warned him once more. He said that down there was no magic, no system, and no salvation, and that a person with a mind of 0 was simply flesh on bones down there. Dargan replied that flesh on bones was a very accurate description, and walked toward the grate. The descent was long. 41 steps, and then another sloping corridor. Down below, it smelled not of dust, but of wet lime. The walls were streaked white from receding water. And right from the entrance began what the old man had spoken of. The bones weren't lying in layers. They had fused together. The water had washed some parts away and left others behind, and now the femurs had fused with the ribs and the ribs with the vertebrae, and all of this stretched along the walls like roots. In some places, entire hands protruded from the wall. In others, the fused mass hung from the ceiling in a cluster as tall as a person. Dargan took the first 20 steps and realized the most important thing. It didn't react to light or sound. It reacted to heat. The cluster above him turned toward him when he exhaled. He stopped and looked at his right hand beneath his gauntlet. His hand was cold as stone. He raised it and held it out in front of him, and the cluster lost track of him. It swayed and then froze. He stood in the darkness, smiling slowly. The price turned out to be more than just a price. He moved on, holding his right hand in front of his chest like a shield, and took another 40 steps before the growth on the left wall lashed out. It was neither a creature nor a corpse. It was a whip made of 6 fused forearms with a fist at the end, and that fist was heading for his throat. The situation was simple. 6 feet in length against his 2-foot arm. Dargan didn't back down. He caught the whip with his forearm, and the blow sent him 3 steps backward. He sat down on the floor, and something snapped in his right shoulder. The whip struck a second time immediately. He rolled aside, and it shattered the stone where his head had been. He stood up. He realized that striking the body was pointless because there was no body. And then he did what one does with a poorly secured beam. He didn't try to break it in the middle. He went for the support. He lunged forward in an arc, hugging the wall, and the whip didn't have time to swing around after him, so he found himself at the base where 6 forearms jutted out of the wall in a bundle. He struck there. Once. The whip's tip pierced the bundle, and the bones snapped with a sound he'd never heard in his life. The whip went limp and crumbled into pieces scattered across the corridor. He stood over it, breathing, and the brand glowed in the darkness. Experience gained. Strength 12. He looked at the debris and thought that this wasn't the end of it. He crouched down, picked out the 2 longest pieces, and took them in his left hand. The brand responded immediately. Bone oozed out and wrapped around his left forearm. The weight increased. 4 pounds on one wrist, 4 pounds on the other. 8 out of 9. 1 remained. And his left hand began to freeze, just like his right. He moved on. What lay ahead was both worse and better at the same time. Worse because there were more growths, and they now came in waves. Better because he'd figured out the pattern. He didn't strike the mass itself, but the spots where the growths attached to the wall or the floor. Sometimes he didn't strike at all. Sometimes he'd simply brace his shoulder against it, break off an entire section, and let it crash down on whatever came next. He lost count during the first few hours. He broke 16 growths. He reached strength 13 and then 14. He was on the brink of death 3 times, and once a growth struck him in the ribs. He later discovered that 2 ribs on the left were cracked, but there was almost no pain because his entire left side had gone numb. At the 3rd turn, he found a token. It wasn't on a body. There was no body. The token was fused into a growth at chest height, and bone had grown in rings around it. The number 214 was clearly legible. Dargan pried it out along with a chunk of bone, slipped it into his shirt pocket, and didn't stop to wonder how the token had ended up inside the wall. At the very end of the lower level was a hall, and in that hall was what the Order had sealed the level for: a joint the size of a cart. It didn't move as long as Dargan stood still. It was waiting for warmth. Dargan sat down on a rock across from it and stayed there for a very long time. He was calculating. He was calculating the weight, the attachment points, and the angle of the vault above the hall. 8 supporting bundles. A vault 4 arshins high. 1 bundle bears about 1/6 of the mass. He recalled someone else's very old idea that a load isn't overcome by force. A load is redistributed. Whoever breaks a support from the wrong side buries himself under what he was holding up. He stood up and did not go toward the creature. He went to the 4th and 5th support beams on the left side and knocked them out one after the other with 2 blows. The creature jerked and toppled to the left, and its entire mass shifted onto the 2 remaining beams. They snapped on their own. The creature crashed to the floor and shattered under its own weight. Dargan stood in a cloud of white dust and looked at the line. Strength 18. He dropped to his knees and put on the goggles without a moment's hesitation. Strength 19. And then the mark changed. Branch unlocked. Bone Berserker. First tier. Grip. He didn't feel a flash. He felt the weight. The world became a third lighter. The bone on his hand ceased to be a burden and became part of his arm. He picked up a fragment weighing 1.5 poods from the floor and held it on his outstretched palm without flinching. He emerged 7 hours after he had gone down. He carried out 3 sacks of bone. He carried out the token. Vesper Gald stood by the grate holding a lamp, and when he saw exactly who was climbing the steps, his face did something that Dargan would remember for a long time. It didn't look frightened. It looked old. The old man watched as the city's burden rose from the level that had devoured 19 men of the Order, and in his eyes, something he had believed in for 40 years shattered. He took the token with his good hand and rubbed it for a long time. He said he had been writing petitions for 11 years. He said he had been laughing in the courtyard with everyone else just yesterday. Dargan replied that he remembered. Vesper said he would remain silent from now on. Dargan replied that he didn't need silence. He needed the key to the lower tier and a place to sleep. The old man gave him both. For 3 days, Dargan went upstairs only to get water. On the 4th day, he went out to buy rope and straps, and at the market, 2 men in blue approached him, Raymond Hess and his man. Raymond looked at the sack on his back and at the gray skin of his hands and asked if the necromancer had made himself a friend from the pit. Dargan said he was carrying the bone to sell to the glue maker. He said it flatly and monotonously and lowered his eyes. Raymond laughed and walked on. Dargan watched his back and thought he'd have to keep it hidden for another 30 days. He was wrong. The next morning, a scribe of the order stood by the ossuary's gate. He unrolled a scroll and read aloud what had already been decided. Assessor Oswin Krill had revised the sentence for the branded Dargan Holt. Reason? A danger to the townspeople. The first review was scheduled for 9 days later. The clerk rolled up the scroll and left without waiting for a reply. Vesper Gald cursed at the wall and said it was outright murder. He explained how the first trial worked. The city square by the eastern gate, 30 paces across. The branded one is pitted against an opponent the order deems a match for a novice. Usually, it's a tiered rat or a scavenger. The assessor chooses the creature. And Dargan had only one assessor. Vesper said that nothing would be decided in 9 days and that they needed to flee the city. Dargan replied that there was nowhere to flee because the brand couldn't be removed and that in any city it would be recognized in a single evening. He said that 9 days was plenty of time. He said that 9 days is 216 hours and that he knows where to put them. And he went downstairs. First cut, second day. The lower tier, 2 galleries away from the main hall. Dargan stood knee-deep in white dust, breaking off one growth after another, no longer cautiously, but methodically. He no longer struck at random. He would approach, look, find a foothold, and strike once. By the end of the second day, he had broken 29 joints, and his arms were gray up to his shoulders. He could no longer feel where his skin ended and his bone began. Strength 21. He took another point and put it into endurance. Endurance 10. His carrying capacity had increased to 10 pounds, and he immediately maxed it out with a shoulder pad made from 2 fused shoulder blades. Fourth cut, 5th day. He no longer carried the bone in sacks. He sorted it. 6 piles had grown up against the far wall of the ossuary, each designated for a specific purpose. Femurs for striking mass, ribs for flexible ligaments, collarbones and shoulder blades for joints and fastenings. Vertebrae were kept separate because a vertebra is a ready-made hinge, and a hinge is the most valuable part of any assembly. Vesper came by to watch and once asked how a kid from Tarnhall knew how to calculate the load-bearing capacity of a bend. Dargan didn't answer right away. He said that a man who had tied a load incorrectly once dropped it on the 4 men below. He said that and fell silent, and Vesper didn't ask any more questions. Third cut, day 7. He was testing his limit. He kept adding weight to the bone until something creaked in his right hip and the brand displayed a red line indicating overload. 11 pounds at a stamina of 10. He removed the excess and committed the number to memory. He understood a rule that wasn't written in the lines. The limit isn't determined by how much he can lift. The limit is determined by how much his own bones can withstand before cracking under the weight of others. Fourth cut, 8th day at night. He didn't sleep. He sat against the wall and assembled. Not armor. Armor would be foolish because all the weight would go into the plates. He was assembling the distribution. 2 bracers, 4 pounds each. 1 2-pound shoulder pad on his right shoulder because he struck with his right. 10 pounds total. And one thing that weighed nothing but was more important than anything else. He hammered 6 short shards into the bracer on his right arm, points facing outward. Bone slides into bone without resistance. On the 9th day, they came for him at noon. 2 guards and a clerk. Vesper followed behind and walked silently beside him all the way to the eastern gate. The city square was packed. People always watched the first trial because it was free and because people sometimes died there. Oswin Kryl sat on the platform for the order, wearing a gray cloak. Standing next to him was Raymond Hess, his hand on the hilt of his sword, smiling. In the third row, Dargan spotted a girl in a gravedigger's leather apron, her arms scorched up to her elbows. Naira Skeld. She'd been digging behind the eastern wall, and she was one of those who hadn't laughed on the day of the branding. She simply turned away. That was worse than laughter. Kryl stood up, announced the test, and named the opponent. He said that a third-tier creature had been selected for the branded one with intelligence 0. He said the name and the circle buzzed. A tiered boar. Not a rat and not a scavenger. A boar from the deep tiers weighing 22 poods with a growth on its forehead that could break through an oak door. Usually, 3 branded individuals from their second year were pitted against the boar. Vesper stepped toward the platform and shouted that this was not a trial, but an execution, and the guards pushed him back with their spears. Kryl looked down calmly. He said that the order valued not strength, but the right to a place in the city. He said that whoever had neither would simply vacate their place sooner. The grate was raised. The boar did not come out immediately. It stood in the passageway, tilted its head, and then walked sideways along the wall, and the crowd fell silent because everyone saw its size. Dargan stood in the center of the circle and didn't move. He wasn't looking at the head or the growth. He was looking at the front legs. The situation was simple. 22 poods against 11 pounds of bone. The boar charged. It took 8 steps to build up speed, and on the 5th step, Dargan saw what he was looking for. A creature weighing 22 poods cannot turn while charging. It can only go straight. Dargan didn't jump out of the way. He stepped sideways, exactly a shoulder's width, and let the beast pass by him. The growth tore into his side, and he felt not pain, but a jolt. He held his ground. The crowd roared. The boar charged on and slammed into the fence, causing half of it to collapse. Dargan straightened up and looked at his side. His shirt was wet and red. He felt nothing. Numbness had taken over, and that sensation too. The boar turned around and charged a second time, and this time, Dargan met it head-on. He ran straight at the beast and, at the last moment, dropped to his knees, slid across the sand, and struck upward with both forearms against the boar's right front leg. The joint. Not the bone. The joint. The leg buckled inward, and 22 poods of flesh at full speed lost its footing on one side. The boar flipped over its shoulder and collapsed, and the whole circle shook. Dargan stood up and walked over to it. The beast was trying to get up on 3 legs and was wheezing. He grabbed it by the growth with his left hand, pressed his knee into its neck, and pulled. He pulled for 8 seconds. On the 8th second, there was a crack. The circle was silent. No one clapped. Everyone just stared at the guy in the torn shirt standing over the 22 Puda carcass, his arms gray all the way up to his shoulders. Dargan turned toward the platform. He didn't shout anything. He simply looked at Oswin Kryl, and Kryl held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds before sitting down. And then Dargan saw Naira Skeld's face in the 3rd row. She was standing, clutching the railing, and her face showed it. Not delight. She was reevaluating everything she knew. The brand displayed a line. First test passed. Highest rating, strength 26. Experience. He had put everything into strength, then looked at the line below it and paused. Second stage of the branch, assembly. Requirement, strength 30. Below that was the second line. Fragments remember the whole. He didn't understand it then. He understood it 11 days later. A man in a black caftan with a copper badge on his chest was walking toward him across the square. Not from the Order. Toller Gansk, the city's debt collector. He approached, looked at the carcass and at Dargan, and pulled a book from his bosom. He opened it to the right page so quickly that it was clear the page had been marked in advance. He said he congratulated the branded man on his right to a place in the city, and immediately after that, he began to read aloud. He said that, according to Tarnhall's law, a branded man who has been granted a class assumes the debts of the house in which he was born. He said that the Holt household owed the city 214 crowns for 4 years of arrears on land taxes and the hearth tax. He said that previously the debt had hung over an empty house and there was nothing to collect from it. But now the debt had hands of its own. He set a deadline, 60 days. And he added that a man who can bring down a tiered boar in 90 heartbeats is highly valued on the labor market, and that the Order and the city would find a use for him. Dargan stood there staring at the book, and a single number kept pounding in his head. 214. The same number that was on the token in the wall of the lower tier. Toller Gansk closed the book and left before Dargan had a chance to ask anything. The circle was dispersing. Vesper Gald pushed his way through the crowd and, without looking at his wound, looked straight at his face and understood everything from the expression there. Dargan told him the number. He said the debt amounted to exactly 214 krona. The old man stood there, unblinking. He said that the Order's tokens were numbered according to squad rosters, that each roster began with the number 1, and that the number 214 could not belong to the third squad of 26 men. He said he had been mulling over that token in his mind for 11 years and had never once asked himself that question. Dargan replied that he would ask it himself and that he would ask it downstairs. Naira Skeld was stitching up his wound. She had come to the morgue that evening with a needle and a bottle, sat down across from him, and worked in silence. She said one thing at the very end. She said that the skin on his side wasn't bleeding as it should. She said the blood was flowing slowly and was cold, and that she'd only seen that in people who'd been pulled from the water after a day had passed. Dargan looked at his gray hands and said nothing. He already knew the price. He didn't know where her limits lay. The next 20 days were spent underground and resulted in 2 cuts. The first cut. He broke open the second grate. Beneath the lower tier of the ossuary was another level. Its entrance had been bricked up, and the Order's seal from 40 years ago was stamped on the masonry. Dargan knocked down the masonry in 3 blows, and beyond it lay not a corridor, but a staircase leading down into Old Tarnhall. A city lay beneath a city. Beneath the cobblestones lay streets and houses and shop signs, all of which had been buried, flooded, and abandoned 400 years ago. And it was all full of bones. The second cut. He was hunting. Not for the spurs. The old levels were inhabited by level-dwelling creatures, and they were faster and smarter, and they moved in packs. He learned them in 9 days. He learned that scavengers feared the cold of his hands, that boars wouldn't turn while charging, that bone hounds followed sound, and that if he threw a bone at the wall on the left, the whole pack would go left and expose their flanks. Strength 27, Strength 28, Endurance 12, Carrying capacity 12 pounds, and he rebuilt his gear from scratch. The bracers became heavier, so he removed the shoulder pad and, in its place, hammered 7 vertebrae from a tiered boar into his back along his spine. He did this to relieve the strain on his lower back. He did this, and a day later realized that he could now support a lever twice as long without losing his balance. He didn't know that the branch read such things. The branch did read them. The 21st day. He stepped out onto the square of Old Tarn Hall, and they were waiting for him there. Not monsters. People. A 12-man squad from the Order, carrying lanterns and fully equipped. They had come down a different staircase from the eastern wall, and they were looking for the same thing he was. And leading the squad was Raymond Hess. From here on, it's best to see things through his eyes, because he saw what Dargan didn't. Raymond was leading the way because he'd volunteered. He was 19, had a dexterity of 24, a blade worth 40 crowns, and a father who paid the order. He'd come down to earn 4 experience points in a single sortie and return as a hero. He saw a figure in the square and at first mistook it for a beast. Then the light from his lantern reached him. It was the town's burden, the very same man he'd tossed a copper coin to in the courtyard. He was standing on the half-ruined staircase of an old house, holding a thigh bone as long as a man. Raymond shouted for the branded man to get lost, and at that moment, dogs came rushing into the square from 3 streets at once. There were 19 bonehounds. Raymond counted them all night long and reached 19 3 times. The squad formed a circle and raised their shields, and everything went according to plan for the first half-minute. Then the dogs circled around the lanterns from behind, and order broke down. Raymond managed to take down 3. He was fast. He was very fast. But a dog from the old ranks weighs 4 poods, and when 4 poods strike a shield from the side, a dexterity of 24 means nothing. He was knocked down. He lay on his back and saw an open maw above him, and at that moment, something very heavy fell from above. The city's scourge leaped from a staircase 8 arshins high and landed on the dog with both feet, crushing him like a box. After that, Raymond lay there watching, not moving. The branded one didn't defend himself. He didn't retreat a single step. He charged into the pack. He grabbed the first one by the skull and hurled it at the second, and both were shattered. He broke the third one's spine with a single elbow strike. He struck with his thigh bone, and the bone snapped on the 4th blow. Then he simply bent down, picked up a fragment of the dog he'd killed a minute earlier from the ground, and continued striking with it. Raymond remembered how he'd been counting. He wasn't counting the dogs. He was counting the seconds between blows. There were less than 2 seconds between blows, and that didn't change until the very end. Not once. That was the worst part. Not the strength, the rhythm. A human doesn't work like that. A mill works like that. He grabbed the last dog by the lower jaw and the upper jaw and spread his arms apart. Then it grew quiet, and in the silence, Raymond heard his breathing and realized that the branded man was breathing evenly. 19 dogs and 3 men from the order lay on the square. He approached Raymond and looked down at him. He had gray hands and a gray neck, and the left half of his face was the color of old wax. He said only that the man was lying on his bone and that he needed to get up. Raymond stood up, and then he watched as the city's scourge walked across the square, gathering the shards into a sack, taking them in his hand, and watching them grow into his forearms before the eyes of 11 witnesses from the order. He realized in that instant that he would have to report this, and he realized that the report would kill this man more surely than any pack. Dargan returned to the ossuary toward morning. He raised his power to 31, and the branch opened. Second stage, assembly. The shards remember the whole. He sat down on the floor, emptied a bag of fragments in front of him, and picked up 2 pieces that had never been part of the same bone. He pressed them together, and the brand responded. The pieces fused along the seam. The seam held. He assembled a club 1.5 arshins long from 7 fragments in the time it takes to count to 30. He struck the wall with it, and it held. He broke it on purpose and reassembled it from the same shards, and it became shorter and thicker. And then he realized exactly what he had received. He hadn't received a weapon. He had received something that could not be taken away. As long as there was a bone on the field, he had a weapon. As long as the enemy broke his weapon, the enemy was making him a new one. He sat on the floor and laughed alone in the darkness, and it was the first time he had laughed in this city. He learned the price an hour later. His left hand stopped obeying him. It wasn't numb. It wouldn't bend at the elbow. He stared at it and ordered it to bend, but it wouldn't obey. He loosened his grip and removed the cuff from it, and the arm fell limply alongside his body as if it belonged to someone else. He sat like that until dawn. Then Vesper came, saw what had happened, and called for Naira. Naira felt the arm for a long time, and then told him the truth without beating around the bush. She said that the flesh on his left forearm had shriveled to half its size. She said that the bone beneath it had grown thicker. She said she'd seen this in old men who'd been swinging a hammer for 40 years, and their bone had grown over the joint. Only those old men were in their 70s. Dargan asked if the arm would return to normal. Naira replied that she didn't know. She said it could be in a day, or a month, or never. The brand revealed a line that hadn't been there before. The threshold, 12%. He stared at that number for a very long time. No one explained to him what it meant. No one explained what happens at 100. He figured it out on his own. Dargan took the sheet and read it twice. 40 crowns per trip. 5 such trips and the debt would be half paid off. He asked what the catch was. Toller Gansk replied that the catch was in the word escort. He explained that the Copper Key Guild transports through the old levels what cannot be transported on the streets. He said he didn't ask what exactly it was and advised Dargan not to ask either. He said that over the past 2 years, the guild had lost 9 porters and 4 hired branded workers on that route. Dargan asked why the city bailiff was bringing him an order from people who transport contraband. Gansk closed his book and looked at him expressionlessly. He said that the city wanted its 214 crowns and that it didn't matter to the city where they came from. He said that a dead debtor doesn't pay, and that a living debtor with a job does, and that was his whole philosophy. Then he left. Vesper said it was a trap. Dargan replied that it was a job, and that the difference between them was how much you got paid. He went to the meeting that same evening. The meeting place was by the eastern wall, behind the glue maker's house. It wasn't the guild waiting for him. It was Naira Skeld. She was sitting on a barrel in her leather apron, and when he approached, she said straight out that she'd obtained the letter herself and that Gansk had been nothing more than a courier because they take bribes from the bailiff, but not from the gravedigger. Dargan sat down across from her and listened. She explained her interest and made no attempt to hide it. She said she'd been digging behind the eastern wall for 6 years, and that the gravediggers of Tarnhall didn't make their living from the graves, but from what they found in the old burial chambers, which they sold through the guild. She said that 14 months ago, her brother Kern had left for the old city with a guild shipment and never returned, and that the guild had paid the family 8 crowns and closed the case. She said she had gone down there herself 4 times and had never made it past the first intersection. She said she needed someone who could navigate the lower levels as if they were their own home. Dargan asked what she was offering in return. Naira replied with 3 things. First, she knows all the bone carvers and bone sellers in the city, and she can sell his bone legally through her gravedigger's mark rather than on the sly. Second, she knows how to sew, mend, and patch, and he'll need that very soon. Third, she knows exits from the old tiers that aren't on the order's maps because the gravediggers dig their own. Dargan didn't think twice. He said he'd take the job on one condition. He said that if her brother down below was dead, he'd tell her straight out and wouldn't beat around the bush. Naira replied that that was exactly what she was counting on. They shook hands, and her palm twitched from the cold of his fingers, but she didn't pull her hand away. The first trip was 2 days later. The cargo was carried by a caravan of 6 porters, led by a foreman named Halm, who carried a lantern along with 2 hired convicts. The crates were reinforced with metal bands and surprisingly light for their size. Dargan hoisted one onto his shoulder as they loaded it and realized that the contents were neither metal nor salt. Inside was something hollow. The route went through the lower level of the ossuary and on through the old city to the west, down the hill, an 8-hour walk. The first 5 hours passed uneventfully. He walked in front and 3 times led the caravan away from what he'd heard before the others did. At first, the porters eyed his hands suspiciously. By the 4th hour, they were following him without looking back. At the 6th hour, they encountered them. Not beasts, people. 8 men blocked the street, and in old Tarn Hall, that could mean only one thing. Halm said they were people from the hill, that the guild had been paying them, and that it had apparently stopped. The situation was simple. 8 against 4 fighters. The 4 were carrying a load on their backs. Dargan stepped forward alone. He didn't say a word. He took the club he'd fashioned from 7 pieces of debris off his back, thrust it into the pavement in front of him, and stood his ground. He lost the first exchange on purpose. 2 of them came in from the left, and he exposed his left side, letting the spear strike. The tip sank into the flesh of his palm and lodged between his ribs. He didn't flinch. He grabbed the shaft with his right hand, pulled the man toward him, and slammed his forehead into the man's face, and the man collapsed. He yanked the spear out of himself and snapped it over his knee. Then things happened quickly. He stepped into the center. He grabbed the second man by the arm and twisted it so that the shoulder popped out of its socket with the sound of a wet twig snapping. He caught the third man under his shield, lifted him along with the shield, and hurled them both at the fourth man. Both crashed into the wall of the old house, and the wall crumbled down on top of them. The fifth managed to strike him on the forearm with his sword. The sword bounced off, and Dargan clenched the blade in his bony palm, snapped it in half, and pierced the sixth man's thigh with the shard. He didn't strike to kill. He broke. He broke them so that they would fall and not get back up, and that was more terrifying than if he had killed them. The seventh and eighth ran off. He didn't go after them. He pulled the fragment of the pommel from his side, looked at it, and saw that there was almost no blood on the metal. He picked up a shard of the broken sword from the ground and drove it into the man's forearm. Halm stood and looked at the 8 men on the pavement and at the man who was breathing steadily. He had been the guild's senior member for 9 years, and he had seen 2 fourth-level branded mercenaries. He had laughed at the city's burden in the Order's courtyard along with everyone else. He walked over and, instead of the 40 krona fee, counted out 60. He said the rest was so that the man would go with them next time as well. Dargan took the money and asked what was in the crates. Halm replied that he wouldn't say. Dargan asked again, and this time placed his hand on the nearest crate. Halm said there was bone inside, not human. He said that the guild transports the bones of tiered creatures from the old city to the upper levels and sells them outside the wall because, in Tarn Hall, the bone trade is a monopoly of the Order. Dargan asked who they were selling them to. Halm replied that he'd be killed for telling him, and fell silent. The caravan reached the top of the western hill 2 hours later. Dargan returned to the ossuary with 60 crowns, a hole in his side, and a new number in his brand, Strength 36. He sat there, looking at the coins, and for the first time in all this time, he felt something resembling calm. His debt stood at 214. He had 60 and a job that paid 60 for 8 hours. Naira was patching up his side and grumbling about how slowly everything was healing, saying she'd found 2 glue makers willing to take bones by the sackful. Vesper was heating water and grumbling, and for a short time, the gallery beneath the city felt almost like home. The calm lasted 4 days. On the 5th day, a young messenger came down from above and said there was a guard standing by the grate. Dargan went up. There were 12 men at the entrance, all dressed in gray and bearing copper seals. At the front stood Oswin Kryl, holding a scroll bearing the city seal and the order seal. He unrolled it and began to read aloud, evenly and without haste, just as he had read in the courtyard on the day of the branding. He read for a long time. The gist of it was contained in 3 points. First, the order reviewed 11 testimonies regarding the incident in Old Tarnhall Square and determined that the branded Dargan Holt is practicing an unrecognized branch of development. Second, this branch is not listed in the order's registry and is deemed corrupted on the basis of the article concerning unauthorized fusion with remains. The bearer of a corrupted branch is not recognized as a person with a class, but as a focal point. Third, all rights of the branded are suspended. He is prohibited from accepting guild commissions. Payment for work already completed is subject to confiscation by the order's treasury. Kryl rolled up the scroll and added one final remark of his own. He said he was offering a choice. The branded one comes to the copper house of his own accord, where the branch is sealed, and he remains to live as a necromancer with an intelligence of 0 and as a burden. Or they take him. He said the deadline was noon tomorrow. He said he did not advise running downstairs because, as of this moment, the entrance to the ossuary was under guard. He turned and walked up the steps. On the 7th step, he stopped and turned back. And he spoke one more sentence, saying it quietly so that only Dargan could hear. He said that 40 years ago, he had already seen a man who picked up a bone with his bare hands, and that man, too, had first gone down to the lower level for someone else's token. The grate behind Kryl clanged shut, and silence fell on the staircase. Dargan stood there, looking up at the empty steps. He kept replaying that last sentence in his head. 40 years ago, the man who picked up the bone with his hands. He too had been coming down to retrieve someone else's token. He turned to Vesper Gald. The old man stood by the lamp, holding it with his good hand and staring at the floor. And that was the first thing Dargan noticed. Vesper didn't ask anything. The man who had spent 11 years writing petitions and 11 years mentally polishing a copper token had just heard that 40 years ago there had been someone just like Dargan in his ossuary, and he didn't lift his head. Dargan remembered this and didn't say a word. He asked something else. He asked what the copper house was. Vesper answered quickly and in detail, and from those details it became clear that he knew more than a bone housekeeper should know. He explained that sealing wasn't an execution. A copper band 2 fingers wide is placed over the brand on the forearm. The band is applied while hot, and it fuses to the arm forever. The brand beneath the copper fades, the class remains, the branch dies. The person goes on living, working, and paying taxes, and the order considers him reformed. Vesper said he had seen 3 people sealed in his lifetime. He said all 3 didn't live long, and all 3 drank. Dargan asked if the band could be removed. Vesper said the copper is fused to the bone and can only be removed along with the arm. Boots were pattering above the grate. 12 people were standing at the entrance, and Dargan could hear them even from here. He sat down on a step and began to count. 60 crowns had been confiscated by the order's treasury. The debt was 214. The repayment period was 53 days. Kryl's deadline was noon. Guild orders were closed. There was no way up. He counted steadily and without anger. Anger would have disrupted his counting. An hour later, at the far end of the gallery, the masonry creaked, and Naira Skeld emerged from the wall. She was covered in clay up to her shoulders and was dragging a sack behind her. She said that the gravediggers had been digging their tunnels for 4 generations, that this one ran from the 3rd field right beneath the wall, and that not even her entire guild knew about it. She dropped the sack and told him to leave immediately. Dargan asked where. She replied, down. He shook his head and explained to her what she already knew. There's no food down there. There's no water down there except for what runs over the lime. You can stay down there for a week. Then you'll have to go back up to the city where people know your face." He said that running down there was the same as drowning slowly instead of drowning right away. Naira asked what he was going to do. Dargan replied that he was going to wait until noon. He lied to her and to himself at the same time. He didn't wait until noon. The order arrived at 3 in the morning. Krill had set the deadline for noon, and Krill was a man who had spent 30 years reading other people's fates aloud and knew exactly one thing. Whoever is given a deadline goes to sleep the night before it. The bars were quietly removed from their hinges. The first to step into the gallery was not a guard. The first to step in was a woman in gray, wearing a double-row copper chain and carrying a chained casket on a strap. Irvet Moln, the Order's sealer. Behind her walked 14 people, half of whom carried buckets rather than weapons. Dargan met them in the narrow passage between the second and third bays, a spot he had chosen the previous evening. The passage was 1.5 arshins wide. No more than 2 people could fit in a row there. He took the club from his back and knocked the first man off his feet with a blow to his shield, shattering the shield in the process, broke the second man's collarbone, and slammed the third into the wall so hard that he stopped moving. For the first minute and a half, they couldn't do anything. The situation was simple: 14 against 1, and all 14 were advancing in pairs. Then Irvet Moln spoke up from behind and said a single word. The men with the buckets stepped forward. Dargan didn't understand and struck the one closest to him. The man held out a bucket and it burst, sending white dust flying into his face. He inhaled it, and it settled on his forearms, his shoulders, and his sweat-dampened neck. Quicklime. Next, they splashed water on him. The lime reacted, and a heat spread through him. Not fire, worse. A steady white warmth that seeped into his bones and stayed there. The bone beneath the lime sizzled and began to crack. His right forearm split open lengthwise and crumbled into pieces. The left one held out for another 10 seconds. Dargan recoiled and, for the first time in all this time, felt something resembling warmth in his hands, and it was the worst feeling of his life. He understood everything in a single heartbeat. Bone succumbs to heat. Lime gives off heat. The Order had known this for 40 years. He retreated to the main gallery, where there was room to move, and there they began to surround him. He took down 4 more with his bare hands because Strength 36 remains Strength 36 even without the bone. He grabbed a guard by the belt and hurled him into 3 others, and the 3 went down. And at that moment, the upper vault of the gallery gave way. The ossuary's vault was supported by old brick arches, and one of them rested on the masonry that Dargan himself had knocked out 4 weeks earlier to create a passageway. He knew about that arch. He had planned to reinforce it later. Later never came. The arch gave way, and the right side of the vault sagged 2 arshins. Bones from the upper tiers poured down, and 2 men were trapped beneath them, a young guard named Kadwan and another whom Dargan didn't know. A slab from the vault landed on their legs and was held up only by a single cracked rib of the masonry. Everyone froze. Kadwan was screaming. Dargan looked toward the exit. There were 22 steps to Naira's passage, and all 22 were clear because the ring had collapsed. He counted them in a single second. Then he considered something else. The slab weighs about 40 poods. There's only one support, and it's cracked. If it's let go, it will collapse completely, and the people beneath it won't even be pulled out in pieces. He had once seen a load fall on 4 people below. He didn't remember their faces, their names, or the city. He remembered only the sound. He turned and walked toward the slab. He slid his shoulder under it, braced himself, and took the weight of the corner that the cracked masonry had been holding up. His shoulder sank down to his palm. He straightened his legs, and the slab stopped. He said calmly and briefly that the two men had to be pulled out by their shoulders, not their legs, and that they had to be pulled all at once. No one moved. He repeated himself. The first to budge was one of the guards he'd slammed into the wall half an hour earlier. Then two more. They pulled out Kadvan, and then the second man, and the whole thing took 40 heartbeats. For all 40 of them, Dargan stood beneath the 40 poods, staring straight ahead at the wall. And right in front of him, he saw Irvet Moln. She stood 3 paces away with an open casket and a copper ring in her tongs, not moving. She had the face of someone who had come to burn out the plague and discovered that the plague was holding up the vault. She looked at him for a long time, longer than her duty required. Then she lowered the tongs toward his right forearm. He saw this out of the corner of his eye. He could have let go of the plate, killed the two of them, and walked away. He didn't let go. The hoop settled on his right forearm over the brand, and Moln turned the tongs, and the copper tightened around his arm. The brand went out. He felt as if something had been removed from his head, something that hadn't been there since birth, something he'd lived without for 17 years, and something he could no longer live without. The warmth left his shoulders. The burden ceased to weigh on him. The grip died. The slab began to descend. He held it up for another 3 seconds on his feet alone, then rolled out from beneath it, and the arch collapsed completely, blocking the gallery all the way to the ceiling. That was what saved him. 8 arshins of broken stone and bone lay between him and the order. He got to his feet and ran. He ran toward the far wall where his 6 piles lay, and he managed to catch one last glimpse of them. The people of Moln were pouring lime from buckets over them, thigh bones for levers, ribs for bindings, vertebrae for joints. 28 days of work. The lime ate away at the bone, and the bone turned white and crumbled, and it looked like wet snow settling. He saw Vesper Gald there as well. The old man stood between 2 guards, and they weren't holding him back. No one was holding him back at all. He stood on his own, watching as the piles were poured, his face blank. Dargan called out to him once. Vesper turned his head and didn't go. Dargan walked away into the gravedigger's passage with that image in his eyes, and it was worse than the lime. Naira practically dragged him along the passage for the last 100 paces. The passage led them to the old tarn hall beneath the western hill, into a dry cistern with a collapsed vault. She sat him down against the wall and shone a light on him, and the first thing she did was grab the band. The copper fit tightly. The skin beneath it had already swollen. Naira felt around, tapped it, cursed, and then suddenly fell silent. She turned his hand toward the light. On the inside edge of the band, right at the very rim, the workshop's mark, the year, and the number were stamped. The copper was old. The year was from 40 years ago. The band had already been worn. The number was deeply stamped and easily legible. 214. Naira sat with a flashlight, running her finger over the engraved numbers and repeating them aloud. Dargan looked at his hand and lined up the third 214 next to the first 2. A token in the wall of the lower tier. The city's debt. The hoop. He said aloud that 3 matches weren't just a coincidence, but a tracking system. Naira asked what exactly it was tracking. He replied that he didn't know, but would find out. Then he tried to remove the hoop. He braced himself with his left hand and pulled, but the copper didn't budge. Instead, the leather beneath it split apart. Strength 36 didn't help at all, because he had to pull not the copper, but his own hand out of the copper ring. He stopped before he broke his elbow. Naira said that copper is cut with a saw, and that the saw would eat through his hand before it cut through the hoop. Dargan said that a saw wasn't needed here. He remembered the glue makers. The glue makers of Tarnhall boiled bone in lye, and their lye sat in vats for years. They replaced the copper clamps on those vats every spring because the lye corroded the copper. He knew this because he'd spent 4 weeks carrying sacks of bone for them. Naira said the lye would eat away at his hand, too. Dargan raised his left arm and showed her his forearm. The flesh on it had shriveled to half its size and turned gray, and he hadn't felt a thing in it since that very night. He said there was nothing left to eat there, and 23 days passed, which he later recalled as a single, unbroken stretch. The first cut. A glue maker named Bost kept the vat right up against the wall, and Bost took the money and asked no questions. Dargan lowered his right arm into the cold lye up to his elbow and sat there for 7 hours straight, then another 5 the next day, and 4 more after that. The lye slowly ate away at the copper, and the band, originally 2 fingers wide, shrank to the width of a finger, and then to that of a fingernail. The skin beneath it peeled off completely. Bost watched this for the first 2 hours. On the third, he went inside and didn't come out again. On the 4th day, Dargan squeezed what remained of the band with his left hand, and the copper snapped. The brand beneath it was black and dead and remained unresponsive for another day. On the 2nd day, it awoke. His grip returned. He picked up the first shard he found on the ground, and the bones slid down his arm and settled, and he sat on the floor in a stranger's yard, holding that arm out in front of him for a very long time. Second cut. New base. The cistern beneath the western hill was dry and silent, with 3 passages leading into it, and only the gravediggers knew of all 3. Dargan sealed off 2 of them and left 1 open. He dragged everything he had there, and everything he had fit into 2 sacks. Naira brought 2 men from her crew, Halvar the digger and his brother. They came to look at the hearths and stayed to haul out bones for a share. Third section. The hunt. For 11 days, he didn't go up to the surface at all. He got to know the old city just as well as he knew the lower level. He cleared out 4 nests of scavengers, 2 packs of dogs, and 1 level-dwelling boar. And on the 9th day, he took down a creature he'd never encountered before. It was blind and long, moving by the vibrations of the floor, and he took it down simply by standing still for 4 minutes. Strength 37, Strength 38, Endurance 13. He reassembled his gear, took it apart again, and reassembled it differently. Fourth cut. Calculation. He realized the main flaw in the old rig. The bone in his hands was suspended by the flesh. The flesh grew tired. The flesh tore. The flesh was the weak link between the load and the support, and anyone who had ever calculated a load knew that a weak link must be removed, not reinforced. On the 17th day, he did what he'd been thinking about all week. He took a fragment of a wild boar's collarbone and pressed it not against the skin of his forearm, but against the spot where his own bone ran beneath the skin. And he pressed down. The brand responded differently. It didn't ooze down his arm. It went deep. He felt the foreign bone find his bone, settle onto it, and fuse with it along the seam. There was no pain. It felt as if a screw had been turned into his arm. The brand displayed a line. Level 3. Skeleton. Bone upon bone. The burden is counted as double. Stamina 13. Load 26 pounds. He sat there staring at that number, realizing that he had just ceased to be a person who carries a bone and had become a person who is made of it. The price came an hour later. The line changed. Threshold of conversion, 26%. In a single evening, the number had risen more than it had in the previous month, and there was a second line below it that hadn't been there before. What had fused together couldn't be removed. He checked. He grabbed his collarbone by the forearm and pulled, but it wouldn't budge. It was now part of him. He sat down on the floor of the tanker and stayed there until morning, counting for the third time that month. 26%. Every substantial piece of the skeleton is 2 or 3%. That means he has 25 or 30 such pieces in reserve for his entire life. That means his strength isn't an infinite resource, but a consumable. That means anything he doesn't manage to do before reaching 100, he'll never do. He didn't know what happened at 100. He knew only that token 214 had been fused into the wall of the lower level at chest height, and that bone had grown around it in rings. In the morning, he went upstairs. The Copper Key Guild occupied 3 houses by the western gate and operated its office under the guise of a salt trading business. The head of the guild was named Selvia Rock. She was nearing 50, wore earrings with 4 rings, and had been running the business for 16 years. Her father had run it before her. Dargan walked in without announcing himself because the 2 guards at the door didn't stop him after he'd knocked one of them off his feet by grabbing him by the shoulder. Selvia Rock looked at his gray hands and said she didn't accept sealed items or hearths and that the order's letter had been sitting on her desk for 4 days. She said that if she accepted a reported hearth, the guild would be shut down and she herself would be put in the circle. She was the 3rd person that month to turn him down and the first to explain why. Dargan didn't argue. He asked how much her crate weighed. She replied that it weighed 45 pounds and that 2 porters were carrying it on a pole. He asked if he could take one of the crates standing against the wall. She allowed it because she was curious. He lifted the crate by the corner with his right hand and hoisted it onto his shoulder, then took the second one with his left, holding both as he stood upright and breathed steadily. 90 pounds on a man who had been declared not human. Selvia Rock watched this, and it wasn't disgust that was breaking across her face. It was arithmetic. For 16 years, she'd calculated the route with the porters. 6 porters, 2 branded guards, 8 shares, 8 mouths, and 8 pairs of legs that set the caravan's pace. She watched the man who replaced 4 of them, walking ahead and seeing in the darkness before anyone else. She said that the order's document had been sitting on her desk for 4 days. And then she said that her desk was large and that there were many papers on it. She placed a new sheet in front of him. An 8-day trek across the entire old city to the north, toward the salt warehouses. The fee? 100 crowns. And she said a third thing without being asked. She said that since he was going to die soon anyway, he might as well know why. She said that the guild had been transporting the bones of tiered creatures for 20 years now, that the buyer beyond the wall was always the same, and that payments were processed through the office in Herbrook, and that 4 years ago, out of curiosity, she had tracked where the shipment went next. The shipment went back to Tarnhall. It went to the Copper House. The order prohibited the trade in bone, and the order bought up all the bone in the city through smugglers, took it over the wall, and brought it back to itself. Dargan stood with the sheet in his hand, comparing it to the lime, the hoop, and the 3 214s. He asked how much bone there was per year. Selvia Rock replied that it was about 900 poods. He left her at noon, and on the street by the entrance stood a boy of about 9, holding a scrap of paper folded in 4. The boy said he'd been given a copper coin and told to deliver it to the hearth from the ossuary. Dargan unfolded the scrap of paper. The handwriting was crooked because the person had written with one hand. Vesper Gald wrote that he was alive, that he was in the Copper House, and that he had not been tried or beaten, that he had found what he had been searching for 11 years. and that he asked Dargan to come tonight to the third air vent of the copper house on the side facing the Tanner's Row, because he had to say one thing about the number on the hoop and could not entrust it to paper. Dargan reread the scrap 4 times and then burned it over the lantern. Naira said it was a trap, and she said it immediately and without hesitation. Dargan replied that he knew. He said that a trap was the only invitation he'd received in a month, and that at least a trap lets you inside. He explained his reasoning aloud to her, and his reasoning was cold. He said that everything in this city converged at the copper house: lime, the hoop, 900 poods of bone a year, room 3214. He said he could wait until the order came for him again, and this time he'd be better prepared. Or he could come himself on the night they'd told him about. Naira asked what he would do if Vesper had sold him out. Dargan was silent for about 3 seconds. He said that the old man had kept him warm for 18 days, heated water for him, and called her over to him. He said he didn't know. Naira gave him a map of the Tanner's Quarter and said she'd follow him to the second intersection, but wouldn't go any further because that's where the Order's territory began. She said one more thing as she left. She said that if he didn't come out by dawn, she'd go in there herself, and that this wasn't a threat, but a schedule. The copper house stood on the north side and was not a single house, but a complex of 4 buildings surrounding an enclosed courtyard. The third vent opened onto a dead-end alley behind the tanneries and was barred by a grate a finger's width thick. Dargan grabbed the grate with both hands and pulled it out along with the frame and a chunk of the wall. Vesper Gald was waiting inside with a lamp. He was clean, wearing a new shirt, well-fed, and didn't smell like a charnel house. Dargan took all this in at a glance, understood everything, and went down anyway. Vesper led him downstairs. The vent led to the basement, and the basement led to a tunnel, and the tunnel did not lead outward, but deeper and downward, and the slope was long and even. They walked for 20 minutes, and the old man spoke the whole time without turning around. He told him the most important thing. He explained that Token 214 had never been a squad number, that the Order does not number squads, that over 400 years there were 214 names in the Copper House's records, and his son, Hyde Gald, was the 214th. He explains that Hyde had attained the Necromancer class 11 years ago and had been assigned an intelligence score of 4, which was practically 0, and that 6 months later he had begun to grasp bones with his hands. Vesper said that he himself had taken him to the Copper House. He said he believed the document about the ceiling and the correction. Dargan asked why then there had been requests to clear out the lower level. Vesper replied that he hadn't written them for the sake of clearing it out. He'd written them so that the Order would one day send someone else down there. And 11 years later, a man who could handle the bone with his hands went down there. The gallery ended. It opened onto a balcony above the hall, and the hall was larger than the entire old Tarn Hall that Dargan had ever seen. He stood on the balcony and looked down. For the first half-minute, he couldn't make sense of what he was seeing. Below was a mass. It filled the entire hall from wall to wall and stretched into the darkness on both sides. It rose as high as the 3rd tier, and it was made of bone. Not a fusion. The fusion in the lower tier was the size of a wagon. This one was the size of a city block. It was breathing. It rose and fell very slowly at half-minute intervals, and this sent a dry rustling sound rippling through the entire hall. People in gray walked along its slopes, pushing wheelbarrows and dumping sacks of bone into it, and the mass took the bone and drew it into itself, and where it drew the bone in, the surface became smooth. 900 poods a year. Dargan watched this, did the math, and realized that 900 poods was not food for such a mass, but merely a stopgap. Vesper stood nearby and spoke more quietly now. He said this was the first one, the one Krill had seen 40 years ago. He said they all end up like this. The threshold of transformation reaches 100, and the person doesn't die. A person becomes this and continues to grow, growing as long as they're fed or until they find something to eat on their own. He said that old Tarn Hall wasn't buried by an earthquake. He said that 400 years ago, the first carrier reached 100 and devoured the entire lower city, and that after that, they established the order, wrote the rules, and started a registry with numbers. Dargan asked why they fed it when it would be easier to starve it to death. Vesper replied that they'd tried that twice. He said that the hungry mass was moving upward. Dargan turned and looked along the balcony. The balcony ran above the hall and extended into the right wing, and in the right wing, niches lined the wall. There were 14 niches. A person sat in each one. Each had a copper band around their forearm. They were alive. They were breathing and looking around, and in 8 of the 14, bone had grown outward, forming a face, an arm, and ribs beneath the skin. One was almost entirely white. He sat upright and still, and his eyes moved. Dargan walked along the niches and read the tokens on their chests. 208, 210, 211. He reached 214 and stopped. Hyde Gald was sitting in the 6th niche. He was turned 3/4 of the way around, looking at his father, and there was understanding in his eyes. Vesper stood 2 paces away and did not come any closer. And Dargan finished reading the row to the end. In the 14th niche sat a guy about 22 years old with red hair and a bracelet on his left hand. He was turned away the most, and he looked brand new. The tag read 218. Dargan had seen that hair before. He'd seen it on Naira Skeld every day for the past 3 weeks. Kern Skeld raised his head and looked at him. And at that moment, behind Dargan, a group of people stepped out onto the balcony. There were 30 of them. Oswin Krail led the way, with Ervet Moln walking beside him, and her people weren't carrying swords. Her people were carrying buckets. Krail spoke, not as an appraiser, but as a man who had finally obtained what he'd been after for a month. He said he wasn't going to prove anything or explain anything. He said he'd offered to seal it once, and that the offer had been fair. He said there would be no offer now. Dargan turned to Vesper Gald. The old man stood his ground, not moving away, staring straight at him without looking away. And that was the worst part of all. Vesper said that Krail had promised to remove the band from Hyde. He said that a sealed item could be drained if they started at 40%, that Hyde was at 70%, that it was a lie, and that he knew it. He said he'd agreed anyway. He said he'd been writing petitions for 11 years, and that a man who waits 11 years will accept any price they name. And he said one last thing. He said he wasn't asking for forgiveness because he had no right to ask. Moln's men advanced in 2 lines, and the front row flung lime. Dargan managed to cover his face. The frame on his forearms hissed and began to crack, and the boar's right collarbone split lengthwise, and he felt a piece of his own arm tear away, because what has fused together cannot be separated, and what has fused breaks along with whatever it's attached to. He broke 3 of them. Then the second chain lashed out at his legs. He fell to one knee. They threw a chain with a hook over his shoulders, pulled on both ends, and dragged him across the balcony toward the staircase leading down to the hall. He could see where they were dragging him. Down below, right next to the mass, there was a cutout area in the floor, and 4 brackets jutted out of it. He resisted, but they kept dragging him, and at the 4th bracket, Ervet Moln bent down and slipped a second pair of tongs with a hoop around his back. And then Krail said one more thing from above. He said he wouldn't enter him in the book. He said that Dargan Holt, with strength 38 and threshold 26, wasn't a number in the book. That was 15 years of rations. The tongs with the hoop extended toward his right forearm, but Dargan wasn't looking at them. he was looking at the brackets. There were 4 of them driven into the stone of the platform, and the chain ran through 2 of them. It wasn't the chain or the hook that was holding him, but those very brackets. He had seen this kind of setup before and knew one thing about it that no one else on this balcony knew. A bracket takes a load along its length. A bracket does not take a shear load. Anyone who drives fasteners into the support along the length of the pool and experiences a transverse jerk loses the fasteners entirely, and usually loses whatever they were holding as well. He had once seen this happen to 4 people below. He suddenly stopped pushing back. He lunged to the side, with all his weight and all the force of 38 in one direction, all at once. 2 brackets came loose from the rock, along with chunks of the floor. The people at the other end of the chain were thrown forward, and 2 of them fell off the platform down toward the mass itself. He stood up with the chain on his shoulders and the hook on his back and turned toward Ervet Moln. And Ervet Moln took a step back. She was the first to step back. Then people poured onto the platform from above, and it became crowded. He didn't try to fight his way to the stairs. He turned around and headed the other way. He walked toward the mass. Lime had corroded his bracers and his frame, and not a single piece of bone remained on him except his own. But beneath his feet was a platform onto which bags of bone had been dumped for 20 years, and all around him lay debris up to his ankles, and he was the only person in that hall for whom the floor was an arsenal. He reached down and picked one up. The assembly responded. 7 shards joined together in the time it takes to count to 30, and he didn't count to 30. He hadn't assembled a club. He'd assembled a shield 1.5 yards long and placed it before him, and the first bucket of lime went into it entirely. The second one, too. The shield turned white and began to crumble, so he threw it aside and assembled a new one from the debris at his feet, a process that took him exactly as long as it took a man with a bucket to run to the barrel and back. And that's when the tables turned. The lime was working against the bone. There were 900 poods of bone under his feet, accumulated over 20 years. Ervet Moln realized this by the 4th shield and ordered a retreat, an order that was correct, but too late. Dargan strode across the clearing, breaking bones. He broke arms and knees and collarbones, doing so smoothly and without pause, with less than 2 seconds between blows. He wasn't killing them. He still wasn't killing them. Vesper Gald stood on the balcony by the railing and saw everything from above. He saw how 30 men of the order ceased to be a formation and became people who were retreating. He saw how Krill left the balcony without looking back, and how Ervet Moln remained. And he saw what Dargan, down below, could not see. He saw that the mob had awakened. Blood spread across the plaza, and the mob caught the scent. Its tide surged forward slowly and steadily, like a landslide. Vesper shouted a single word from above, and it was the only word he spoke during the entire battle. Dargan turned and saw. The slope was advancing toward the plaza, and standing in its path were 4 Moln people who could no longer move. The mass swept over them, and they stopped screaming 2 seconds later. Where it had passed, a smooth white surface remained. Dargan looked at the balcony. Between the mass and the staircase was a 4-arshin-wide passage. It was still open, and one could escape through it. He looked to the right. In the right wing, directly above the hall, there were 14 niches, and the mass would reach them in a minute. He headed to the right. He cleared the staircase in 3 leaps and emerged into the right wing, where Vesper Gald was already waiting. The old man stood by the 6th niche, holding his son by the shoulder with his good arm, while Hyde Gald looked at him, unable to stand or speak because bone had grown through his jaw, chest, and thigh. Dargan approached the 14th niche. Kernskeld was the least transformed of them all, and he was able to speak. He said that he had been taken on the route 14 months ago, and that it wasn't the people from the hill who had taken him, but the Order. He said he had seen 3 others being brought in. He asked about his sister. Dargan replied that she was digging near the 3rd field, that she had been looking for him for 14 months, and that she would have come here herself if she'd known the way. Kern closed his eyes. Then he asked. He asked very calmly and very clearly, and he asked only once. He said he'd been sitting in this niche for 14 months and had seen what happened to those who sat it out until the end, and that further down the row sat a man who'd sat it out and whose only movement now was his eyes. He said he didn't want to become a wall. Dargan stood before him, and inside, everything in him was focused on a single point. He had never beaten anyone to death. Not in the circle, not in the square, not under the hill. It wasn't mercy. It was his only rule, and he stuck to it because a man who starts treating other people's lives as expendable very quickly discovers that his own has been spent as well. He'd stuck to that rule for 17 years and would have kept doing so. And then he looked down the row of niches and counted one last time that night. 14 people. The crowd would be here in a minute. He could carry out 1, maybe 2. He looked at the white man in the 3rd niche, whose only moving part was his eyes. He took a step and did what had to be done, quickly, in a single motion, and then moved on down the row. He walked the entire length of the row. Vesper Gald had not given him his son. The old man stood in front of the 6th niche, holding Haida by the shoulder with his good arm, and said that this was his son, his duty, and his time. He told Dargan to leave. Dargan hoisted Kern Skeld onto his shoulder because Kern was the least transformed of them all, and because Kern was a quarter more alive than the rest. And he walked along the right wing toward the distant vent he'd seen from the balcony. Vesper Gald remained behind. The last thing Dargan saw was the old man sitting down on the floor next to the 6th niche, and the crowd streaming out into the right wing. He made his way upstairs through the row of tanneries just before dawn. Kern Skeld died on his shoulder 200 paces from the exit. He died quietly, and Dargan didn't realize it until he laid him on the ground. Nyra Skeld was waiting at the dead end behind the tanneries, and she had been standing there all night. She saw him. Then she saw what he was carrying. Dargan laid the body on the stones and told her straight out, without beating around the bush, exactly what he had promised to say from the very beginning. He said that it wasn't the hill that had taken her brother, but the order, that he had spent 14 months in a niche beneath the copper house with a copper band on his arm, that he had been alive just an hour ago and had asked for one thing, and that Dargan had carried him out because he was alive, not because he could save him. Nyra listened while standing. She didn't sit down or scream. She sank to her knees, removed the copper token from her brother's wrist, clutched it in her fist, and remained silent for a very long time. Then she asked how many of them had been there. Dargan replied that there were 14. She asked how many had made it out. He replied that there was 1, and that he had died on the way. She asked what had happened to the other 13. Dargan didn't beat around the bush. He said he'd done it himself. Nyra raised her head and looked up at him, and there was no horror in her eyes, and that was more terrifying than if he had been there. She said she knew what a niche was because she'd been digging for 6 years and had seen what they pulled out of the pits behind the eastern wall. She said thank you. She said it once and never repeated it again. They sat in the dead end until dawn. Dargan stared at his hands. The lime had eaten away all the bone and stripped the flesh down to the tendons, and a chunk was missing from his right forearm. The brand burned evenly. The line had been before his eyes ever since he'd walked past the row of niches to the end, and he was reading it for the 4th time. Experiment successful. Power 47. And beneath it, a second line. Threshold of activation, 34%. Naira got up from her knees when it was fully light. She said she would bury her brother herself, that she would dig the grave herself, and that she needed a day to do it. Dargan said they didn't have a day. He explained why, and he kept it brief. The Order had lost more than 20 men beneath the hill in a single night, not in battle against the creatures, but in a fight against a single branded. You don't hide something like that. You announce it first, so you can tell the story your own way. He was proven right 6 hours later. At noon, a single proclamation was read in all 4 squares of Tarn Hall. The Order announced that during the night, a hearth from the ossuary had infiltrated the copper house and released the filth from beneath the hill, and that 23 servants had perished defending the city. The Order declared the Circle of the Hearth. Under ancient law, the city could place the declared hearth within a circle against a designated fighter and settle the matter once and for all based on the outcome. To whoever stepped forward to face the hearth, the Order promised a class rank, 40 crowns, and a place in the copper house. And that very same day, the Order announced the fighter's name, Raymond Hess. Dargan heard that name from a young messenger boy in the cistern beneath the western hill, and the first thing he did was laugh. Naira asked what was so funny. He replied that 3 months ago, this man had tossed a copper coin at his feet and said that the dead needed someone who knew how to dig. He said that in 3 months, nothing in this city had changed except for one thing. And he spent the next 2 days making sure that one thing became final. First cut. He went down into the old city and hunted for 2 days and nights with almost no sleep. He took 4 nests, 1 flock, and 2 boars, and at the end of the second day, he found what he'd been looking for in a flooded neighborhood. A tiered ox. A beast weighing over 60 poods that gravediggers gave a wide berth. He took it down the same way he'd taken down the first wild boar. He knocked out its supporting joint as it charged and then held it by the horns for 40 seconds. Strength 49. Second cut. He spent 12 hours butchering the ox, taking it apart as one would dismantle a building. The ox's rib was 1/4 of an arshin long and 2 fingers thick, and it withstood impact better than any human bone. The shoulder blade was cut into a slab. The vertebrae were made into joints. He set aside 18 cuts and gave the rest to Naira's cooperative to sell. The third cut. He joined them together. Each piece fit onto its own bone, and each took its own 2 or 3%. He did this slowly, counting aloud, while Naira sat beside him and wrote the figures on a board with charcoal. She kept better track of the numbers than he did. On the 8th piece, she said, "Stop," and he paused. She said that 34% plus 8 pieces equals 48, and that he was just a hair's breadth away from half. Dargan looked at the board, sat down beside her, and told her what he'd realized back in the tank a week ago. He said that he didn't have years in reserve, but pieces. That each piece was 2%, and that he could do 25 big things or 50 small ones, and that after that, he'd become a wall under someone's house. He said that now he wasn't thinking about how to get rich, but about what to spend it on. Naira erased the number 48 from the board, wrote it again, and said nothing. Fourth cut. Last night, he didn't splice anything together. He assembled. He assembled something from ox ribs, dog bones, and shoulder blades, something he'd never done before. He assembled a back knot from 7 ox vertebrae, inserted bundles of ribs on either side, and laid them along the spine, folded together. He tested it for weight and tensile strength, and then spent 3 hours reworking the attachment to his shoulder blade. He didn't know if it would work or not. The branch had made no promises to him. The Circle of the Hearth gathered on the 3rd day at the eastern gate, in the same spot where he had brought down the boar. There were 3 times as many people as at the first trial. Oswin Krill sat on the Order's platform in a gray cloak, and Ervet Moln stood beside him with her arm in a sling. In the front row sat Ansel Hess, the tax collector and Ryman's father, and he had brought along 12 of his men. Raymond Hess was the first to step into the circle. He was 19 and had a dexterity of 26 following the fall trial, along with a blade worth 40 crowns and 4-layer laminated leather shoulder guards. He stepped forward confidently, and he had every right to do so, for he had been trained for 8 years. Dargan entered the circle at noon, walking in alone through the eastern gate as the guards parted. He made his way through the crowd, which stepped aside, and he heard the noise die down. He wasn't wearing a shirt. For the first time, the people of Tarnhall saw what 48% looked like. The ribs of an ox ran along his forearms, shins, and chest, and they were not merely worn, they grew from him. The skin on his left arm ended at the elbow, and beyond that lay white bone, upon which the ribs of dogs rested. Half his face was the color of old wax. The circle was silent. Raymond Hess stared at this, motionless, and Dargan could see from his expression that he was recalling the old town square and the 19 dogs, and how he had counted the seconds between blows. Krill stood up and announced the conditions, delivering them just as evenly as he had read the line on the day of the branding. He said that the circle would continue until only one remained standing. Dargan turned toward the platform and spoke for the first time in all this while, speaking loudly so that even those in the back row could hear. He said that beneath the copper house a mass of bone had been kept for 400 years. That the order fed it 900 poods a year through the Copper Key Guild, circumventing its own law. That there were 214 names in the order's book. That the night before last, he had brought out from there Kern Skeld, the gravedigger from the third field, who had disappeared 14 months ago, and whom the entire eastern row considered to have fled with the guild's cargo. The crowd stirred. Krill's expression didn't change one iota, and he said that the hearth spoke what all hearths spoke, and gave a signal. Raymond stepped forward. He was fast. He was very fast, and for the first 40 seconds, Dargan didn't touch him. He took the blows on his forearms and chest plate and watched. Raymond landed 4 strikes, one of which was a good one, driving his blade between the ox's ribs to the hilt, and Dargan looked at the wound and saw that there was no blood at all. Not a drop. None. He looked up at Raymond, and Raymond saw it too. After that, Dargan stopped waiting. He stepped forward, and Raymond stepped aside and struck again. This time, Dargan didn't dodge the blade. He caught it with his bony palm and squeezed, and the 40-crown blade snapped right at the hilt. He grabbed Raymond by the shoulder strap and lifted him off the ground with one hand, holding him there for 3 seconds in full view of the entire circle. Then he set him back on his feet and let him go. He hadn't struck him even once. He spoke to him face to face in a low voice that only the front rows could hear. He said that the copper coin was still lying where he dropped it. Raymond Hess stood in the center of the town square, without a blade, on his own 2 feet, and unharmed, and that was worse than any broken bone. He looked at the man who could have broken him in 2 but chose not to, and who had let him go in front of his father and 12 of his father's men. He turned and walked toward the edge of the circle, and on his 4th step his knees buckled, and he sat down right in the sand and remained there. And then Oswin Kryl gave a second signal. From the 2 entrances, men of the order entered the circle carrying buckets. 40 men. Lime. Kryl had said from above that the circle of the hearth would continue until only one remained standing, and that the order had not promised there would be only one left standing. The first bucket struck Dargan in the chest, and the ox's ribs hissed and began to crack, and he felt what had fused with him breaking apart. He took a step back, pouring everything he had learned in 3 months in this city into that single step. Lime eats bone. There are no bones inside the circle. The bone is only on him. That meant he shouldn't be alone. He turned toward the eastern gate and bellowed a single name. Nyra Skeld stood at the gate with a work crew and 2 carts, the carts covered with burlap. She ripped off the burlap and tipped the first cart right into the circle. 14 poods of bone rolled across the sand. Dargan lowered his arms. The assembly took shape all at once. He hadn't assembled a shield or a club. Behind his back, he'd assembled what he'd been preparing all last night, and the back knot made of 7 ox vertebrae opened up. Bundles of ribs spread out to the sides and upward, unfolding behind his shoulders into 2 fans, each 4 arshins wide. They held themselves up on their own. They didn't hang from his arms. They stood on his own bones and moved by his grip, and Dargan realized in that instant that he didn't know how he was moving them, and that it no longer mattered. The lime had gone into them, all 40 buckets. He brought the fans together in front of him, and they took on the white color and turned white, and he shed the white in a single motion and reassembled them from what lay at his feet. The brand burned so brightly that it was visible through his palm. The 4th step. The roof. The bone supports itself. He marched toward the order's formation across the entire circle, and the formation collapsed after 20 steps. People with buckets ran toward the gates, and Ervit Muln stepped onto the platform and dragged Krayla away with the strength of her sturdy arm. Dargan stopped in the center of the circle. He raised his right hand, and in it was a 40-year-old copper hoop that he had etched with lye and had been carrying in a sack for 3 weeks. He flung it onto the platform at the feet of the appraiser's empty chair, and the hoop clattered across the planks. He spoke his final words so that all 4 rows and a half of the eastern quarter could hear him. He said that the number 214 was stamped on this hoop, that the same number appears in the city's debt register next to the name Holt, that it was not written by the city clerk, and that he would come for the one who wrote it. The crowd stood there and did not disperse for a long time. And 2 hours later, as Dargan was walking through the Tanner's Row, a man in a black caftan with a brass badge caught up with him. Toller Gansk was walking quickly and had no ledger with him. He said the ledger had been confiscated that morning. He said the debt of 214 crowns had been entered into it 9 years ago in handwriting he hadn't recognized until yesterday. He said that yesterday he had checked it against the Copper House's register. He said that it was Oswin Krail's handwriting. And he added a third thing. He said that the amount of the debt was listed by number in the book, and that there were now 218 names in the order's book, and that 4 hours ago, the 219th had been entered into it. Toller Gansk stood in the Tanner's Row, waiting for an answer, and Dargan did not reply for nearly a minute. He asked whose name had been entered. Gansk said he did not know. The order's register was kept in the Copper House, and he had not been allowed into the Copper House since that very night. But he said something else, and that was more important. He said that the city kept its own register. The debt archive on Medni Shnaya Street maintained a mirror copy of the records because the city, not the order, collected the taxes, and every entry from the order's register was transcribed into the city's records as a line item. He said that the archive was secured with 3 locks and guarded by 2 old men. Dargan asked why the city bailiff was bringing the household registers to the city archives. Gansk replied that for 9 years he had been entering other people's numbers into the book and had never once asked where they came from. He said he had asked yesterday. They entered the archives that very night. Nyra Skeld led the way with a lantern. Halvar stayed at the entrance. Dargan removed the door along with the jam, and both guards didn't say a word. They sat down against the wall, and one of them held the lamp for them all night long. Hansk knew where to look. He pulled out 4 volumes, each covering 40 years, laid them out on a long table, and began reading aloud the lists of houses with tax arrears. And after an hour, something became clear that no one had seen before because no one had ever looked at these figures in sequence. Among the hundreds of irregular amounts in crowns and copper coins, there were some that were exact. The Raven House, 199 crowns. The Talbury House, 201 crowns. The Vickers House, 205. The Holt House, 214. There were 9 exact amounts over 40 years. Not a single one matched another. They all increased in order, and they all appeared at intervals of 4 or 5 years. Gansk placed his finger on the line for the Holt House and said what he had realized first. He said that the amount of the debt wasn't a sum, it was a number. Naira asked what number it was. Dargan answered before Hansk, a number in the Copper House ledger. Hansk turned the page and pointed to a note in small handwriting beneath the entry. 2 words, replacement. He explained that he'd seen this note for 9 years and had assumed it was just a clerical note. He said it meant the house was responsible for the replacement. The rest fell into place on its own. Hyde Gald had been assigned number 214 11 years ago and had taken the 6th niche. 2 years later, Oswin Krail had written in his own handwriting 214 crowns against the Holt House and marked it for replacement. Dargan was 8 at the time. He sat at a long table, looking at his own neat debt, and everything in his head came together into a single, very simple structure. The house owed the city no money. The house had been ordered to provide a body to replace the one already sitting in the niche. The debt was not a bill. The debt was a leash. If the house gave up one of its own, the debt would be extinguished. If the house refused, the debt would be enforced, and the debtor would be sold into the bone pits. In either case, the order got what it wanted. Naira asked how Krill could have known that an 8-year-old boy would, 9 years later, attain the Necromancer class with an intelligence of 0. Gansk answered that question as well. He said that the appraiser prepares the branding seal. He said he'd seen them being prepared once, and that they engrave the inscription in advance on a copper base, and that the townspeople are told it's as if the seal itself writes the inscription when it's pressed onto the skin. Dargan looked at the brand on his forearm, a copper circle with 4 prongs. A 0 in the mind was not a failure. A 0 was an order. A 0 was given to those who were meant to take their place in the niche and were not to become a threat on the way there. He didn't stand up or slam his fist on the table. He sat there and calculated, and the calculation was cold and therefore terrifying. He thought about how, from his very first day in this city, a foreign ability to calculate the load had lain in his head, and how he had never once allowed himself to ask where it came from. He recalled one thing very briefly and very clearly. He remembered that he had once been a man who signed off on the calculations, and that once, in one of his calculations, a single number had been wrong. He didn't allow himself to do that again. He returned to the sheets. Gansk was already leafing through the volume from 9 years ago. He found the Holt household for the second time and called out softly. The inventory listed 2 entries for a single week. Orvel Holt, departed on order business. And below that, Ilsa Holt, departed. Gansk explained that departed on order business was written when a person was taken to the Copper House. He said that simply departed was written when a person had died and the city hadn't investigated the cause. Dargan looked at the 2 words and understood why the Holt's empty house had stood empty for 9 years and why no one in Tarn Hall had ever said a single word to him about his family. They hadn't been forgotten. They'd been kept silent. Naira placed her hand on his shoulder and immediately pulled it away because his shoulder was cold as stone. He told her everything was fine, and that wasn't true, and they both knew it. And then Gansk found the 3rd one. He opened the current year's volume to the last few pages where the ink was still damp. Yesterday's entry. The Hess House. 219 crowns. Change. Dargan stared at the line and did the math. Raimund Hess had lost a round but survived and was still standing. The order had lost more than 20 men under the hill and 13 out of 14 niches. Massey needed a replacement, and he needed one immediately. Ansel Hess hadn't paid for his son's failure with money. He paid with his son, and most likely didn't even know it yet. They left the archives before dawn, carrying 4 volumes with them. Dargan headed straight from there to the tax collector's house. The Hess house stood on the north side behind its own wall, and there were 15 armed men in Ansel Hess's courtyard. They recognized the figure approaching from the gate. No one raised a hand. Ansel Hess came out onto the porch himself. He was nearly 60 and had been collecting taxes from 3 neighborhoods for 19 years, and he looked down at Dargan the way one looks at bad weather. He said he didn't collect taxes from the households and wouldn't speak with them. Dargan stepped up onto the porch and placed a sheet of paper in front of him. Ansel read it, laughed, and said it was a forgery, that he himself had paid 40 crowns in ransom for his son at the Copper House just yesterday morning, and that the matter was closed. He spoke loudly and confidently, continuing right up until his own steward emerged from the depths of the house, the night mail in his hands. The steward didn't know what was happening on the porch. He simply handed his master 2 scrolls and said that the second one had arrived from the Copper House at the 3rd hour, that it contained a charge, and that he didn't understand what it was for. Ansel Guess unrolled the scroll. 219 crowns. At the current exchange rate. He read it for what seemed like a very long time for just 4 lines. Then he raised his head and looked not at Dargan, but at his 15 men in the courtyard. And Dargan saw 19 years of service to the city crumble in that man's face. Ansel Guess collected taxes for the order from 3 neighborhoods and believed that with this he was buying a place, security, and a future for his son. He held the scroll in his hands and realized that all this time he had been paying in advance so that his son might one day be enshrined in a niche. He asked where Raimund was. Dargan replied that he didn't know and that he would find out. Ansel Hess sat on the steps of his porch with his 15 men and remained there until dawn. Then he stood up and said one thing. He said that he had money, men, and connections in the 3 districts, and that all of this was now worth exactly as much as would be needed. On his way back, Dargan walked through the Eastern District and saw that the city had changed overnight. New proclamations from the Order hung on every corner. The Order had declared Tarnhall to be tainted. Anyone with gray skin or exposed bone was to be taken to the Copper House for purification. Those who harbored them were put in the circle. The city gates were closed at night and opened only during daylight hours. Patrols roamed the eastern quarter, rounding up not only the gray ones. They took debtors, the sick, and those who didn't have their brand with them. Gansk watched this and said that in a single morning they'd taken no fewer than 40 people, and that they didn't haul that many to the bone pits in a whole year. Dargan realized where they were being taken. He killed 13 in the niches and carried out the 14th, and the mass failed to receive what it had been receiving for 11 years. The Order made up the difference with people. He went down into the cistern beneath the western hill and hardly came up for 3 days. First cut. He hunted in the flooded neighborhood and took 2 wild boars and a nest. And on the 3rd day, he pulled a rib from a tiered ox out of the silt. It had been lying there for who knows how long, and was heavier than anything he'd ever handled before. Second cut. He was splicing. 3 pieces in a row. Naira sat next to the board and the charcoal, keeping count, and after the 3rd piece, she wrote a number on the board and circled it. 51. He looked at the number and said he was halfway there. 3rd cut. He was reworking the back knot. The fans of ribs held on their own but unfolded slowly, and in the circle he was saved only by the fact that the order was flustered. He adjusted the joints on the ox's vertebrae and managed to make the fans spread out to the sides in a single heartbeat. Strength 52. On the fourth day, a man from Selvia Rock descended into the cistern. He brought 2 words on a scrap of paper. The convoy leaves in 6 days. And a note from Selvia herself. She wrote that the Copper House had doubled the order and was demanding not 900 poods, but 1,800 to be delivered by the end of the month. She wrote that the order had not changed once in 20 years, and that she would refuse to transport it if anyone could explain to her how this would end for the city. Selvia Rock came to the cistern on her own the following evening, without any guards, and that told Dargan more than anything she said afterward. 5 people gathered. Her, Ansel Hess, Toller Gansk with 4 volumes, Naira Skeld from the 3rd Field Cooperative, and him. Everyone had different interests, and he didn't try to smooth them over. He laid them out aloud. Selvia Rock needed the guild to survive what was about to begin, break free from the order, and start transporting the bone openly. Ansel Hess wanted a son and nothing more. Gansk needed to ensure that his signatures from the past 9 years wouldn't be implicated in a murder. Naira needed to make sure that gravediggers would no longer go missing in Tarnhall. He said he wouldn't pretend they had a common cause. He said they had a common enemy, and that would be enough for a month. The plan consisted of 3 moves. Selvia Rock would stop the wagon train and not transport a single pood. Toller Gansk would file 4 volumes with the city's debt court and demand the settlement of 9 equal sums. Dargan would go down to fetch Raymond and the book. Selvia asked what would happen to the mass if they stopped feeding it. Dargan answered honestly. He said that a hungry mass rises. He said that a man who had been feeding it for 20 years had told him this. Selvia Rock was silent, and then said that in that case, they had to choose between feeding it with people and letting it come out on its own. Dargan said that was exactly the choice they faced, and that there was no third option yet. Ansel Hess asked if a third option would appear. Dargan replied that it would appear when he figured out how to get a grip on something the size of a city block. He went to the Copper House on the 3rd night and didn't make it past the 3rd air vent. They were waiting for him at the dead end behind the tanneries. She was alone. Ervit Moln stood there with a lantern, her arm in a sling, and her palms open. She said that if she'd wanted to take him, she would have brought 40 men and buckets. She didn't speak for long, and she spoke like someone who had decided in advance to say everything. She said she'd been serving at the Copper House for 22 years and had married off 19 men. She said that for all 22 years, people had explained things to her, and she'd explained the same things to others. Beneath the hill lies what devoured the lower city 400 years ago. It sleeps for now, sated. There are 30,000 people in Tarnhall, 900 poods of bone a year, and 1 carrier every 12 years. That is the price for 30,000. She said she had considered that price cheap until the very night she saw how the declared hearth stood beneath the stove instead of leaving. Dargan said the price was cheap for those who didn't pay it. Irvet Moln replied that this was true and that it didn't make her calculation incorrect. Then she gave him what she had come for. She spoke of lime. Lime doesn't kill the mass. Lime takes only the surface and forms a crust, and beneath the crust, everything is alive. Krill had kept her in crusts for 40 years, and those crusts had taught him to regard the mass as controllable. She said that this was a mistake, and that she had kept silent about it for 4 years. And she said a second thing, and the second was greater than the first. She said that she had reread the Copper House from the first-person perspective. All 218 wore the hoop. All 218 began to grow after it was put on them. Not a single one had begun to grow before that. Dargan stood there, piecing this together with what he'd seen in the niches and with what he'd had on his arm for 4 days. He asked directly. He asked whether it was the hoop that turned a person into mass. Irvet Moln replied that she didn't know. She said that for 22 years she'd considered the hoop a cure, and that now she considered it a question. She told him where they were holding Raimund Hess, then left first without looking back. He entered the copper house that very night, and he wasn't alone. Ansel Hess provided 11 men on the condition that he go himself, and Dargan didn't argue. They took the third air vent, passed through the basement, and emerged onto the balcony. Down below, everything was worse than it had been a week ago. The crowd had surged all the way up to the balcony of the right wing, and a dry rustling filled the entire hall. Not a single person in gray was to be seen below. They no longer dared to come close to feed her. The niches in the right wing were occupied again. Not 14, 9. 8 of the 9 were fresh, and Dargan recognized the faces of 2 of them from the eastern quarter. Raimund Hess was sitting in the third niche. A new hoop was secured to his left forearm, turned at a 9% angle, and he was conscious. The fight was short and vicious. They were met by 12 men with buckets, and Dargan took the lime on his fan, reassembling it twice from what lay on the platform. He took down 7 of them. Jess's men carried all 9 out of the niches, carrying them in their arms, and 3 of the 9 died on the way upstairs. The book was not in the copper house. Krill had taken it away. The hoop from Raimund was pickled at Bost's in a vat for 9 hours. Ansel Hess sat next to the vat all night, holding his son's head. The copper came off by morning. The skin beneath it had peeled away down to the flesh, and after that, Raimund's left hand would not fully open, and it remained that way. He looked at his own hand and then at Dargan's gray hands and said one thing. He said that now he understood why Dargan had been holding the slab. He said it incorrectly and in his own way, but he said it sincerely, and Dargan did not correct him. Raimund recounted what he had heard in the alcove. Krill had come to him twice and spoken with Irvet Moln in his presence, just as one speaks to a piece of furniture. He said that the bone was a stopper, that the mass takes the bone but isn't sated by it, and that only a bearer who has reached the end can sate it. That 11 years had passed since Hyde galled, and the mass had grown restless, and that taking 40 people from the quarter was a 1-month reprieve, not a solution. And he spoke of Dargan. He said that Dargan Holt, at half the threshold and with such power, was worth 10 hides. That if he were brought up to 100 and placed in the clamps, the mass would receive not sustenance, but a new version of itself. That the old mass would then settle down and fall asleep, and sleep for a long time. Krill believed that a new vessel that reached its full potential would grant the city another 400 years of peace. Dargan listened and understood that during his 3 months in this city, he had not been a hindrance. He was a crop that had first been cultivated from a seed in the mind and then grown anew. Krill didn't want to kill him. Krill was waiting for him to mature. 2 days later, Selvia Rock turned the wagon train around. 1,800 poods did not go to the copper house. She did it in full view of 24 people at the northern warehouses, and she did it loudly. 2 days later, a rumor spread through the eastern quarter that the wells had turned white. Dargan went down to see for himself. The water in 3 wells was cloudy with lime, and the cloudiness rose from the bottom. That night, beneath Kozhevnikov Street, the ground trembled twice. The order responded on the 3rd day. Krail announced a purge. Notices were posted on every corner, stating that, to stamp out corruption, the city was handing over to the order everyone listed on the debt rolls and anyone the patrols apprehended without a brand. In 2 days, they rounded up about 200 people and led them not to the bone pits beyond the wall, but through the northern gate toward the hill. Toller Gansk filed 4 volumes with the debt court on the morning of the 4th day, and the court accepted them for review and scheduled a hearing. He left the courthouse, and Dargan was waiting for him in the square. They both heard something moving beneath the square. The sound was low and steady, coming from the east. Then, 3 blocks away from them on Kozhevnikov Street, the pavement bulged and burst open. Something white rose from the crack. It was twice a man's height, growing before their eyes, and it was made of bone. The white thing rose from the crack and stood above the pavement, and for the first 5 seconds, no one ran because no one understood what they were seeing. Then it swayed and lay down on the corner of a building, and the building collapsed like a box. Dargan was in the square and walked 3 blocks, reaching the scene in 2 minutes. The offshoot was not a creature, it was a spur. It didn't strike or chase, it crept, and everything that came under it ceased to exist, leaving a smooth white surface in its wake. Dargan grabbed it by the root, just as he had grabbed the outgrowths on the lower level 11 weeks earlier, and realized the difference with the very first blow. The outgrowth had supports. The offshoot had no supports. It was entirely a support itself. He spent 40 minutes breaking it. He struck its base, and the base would split apart and fuse back together within a dozen heartbeats. It fused with 2 pieces right there on the street because weight was needed, and Naira was shouting the number from the board up to him from below, and the number was 58. He only managed to crush the spur when he realized he shouldn't break it but drag it. He grabbed it and pulled it out of the crack, a length of 12 arshins, and tore it away from what remained below. The torn-off piece died within a minute. He stood over the white strip in the middle of Kozhevnikov Street and understood the main news. Mass can be restored from any fragment, and it cannot be broken into parts because each part is the mass itself. The debt court heard the case the following morning before a packed chamber. Toller Gansk read for 4 hours. He read 9 equal sums and 9 notes regarding replacements. He read the lines concerning departures as required by the order, and he read their surnames aloud. By the 3rd hour, people in the chamber began to respond. Those who had lost someone during those years responded. Ansel Hess provided the court with funds for the investigation, did so openly, and announced it from the podium, a gesture that cost him more than half his fortune. Ervet Molm came to court herself, testified, and spoke of the 19 rings she had placed on her own hands. By evening, the city court had reached a verdict. Oswin Krail was stripped of his position as appraiser and of all his rights within the city. 9 debts were declared null and void. The Copper House was placed under city supervision. The crowd remained in the square until dark and did not disperse. And in that crowd, Dargan saw the faces of people who, 3 months earlier, had been laughing in the order's courtyard. He walked through the north gate into the Copper House openly at noon, and no one stopped him. He cleared 4 buildings in an hour and killed no one. Krayla wasn't there, nor was the book. And that was when the floor gave way. It happened at 3 o'clock in the morning and began not with a crash, but with a rumble. The rumble lasted about 2 minutes. Then the eastern quarter sank. 3 streets sank 4 arshins at once, dragging 41 houses down with them. White dust rose from the sinkhole, and along with the dust, whatever had been beneath it came up. It was the longest night Dargan had ever spent in this city. He worked in the sinkhole until dawn, using his hands. He broke off spurs, pulled apart logs, and held back 2 landslides while people were being pulled out from beneath them. The 3rd field crew was working nearby. Hess's men were working nearby. The Copper Key Guild had brought in carts, and on those carts they were carrying not bones, but the wounded. Selvia Rock went into the sinkhole 4 times. On her 4th trip, she went to rescue a woman with 2 children in the basement of the house on the corner. She brought the children out and returned for the woman, and at that moment, the corner of the house collapsed. They pulled her out 6 hours later. She was already dead, and she was clutching someone else's hand. Her people took over the guild, and the first thing they did was take all her papers to the debt court and turn in 20 years' worth of contraband themselves. Dargan was sitting on the edge of the sinkhole when dawn broke. Naira brought a board. The board read 62. He had fused with 4 pieces overnight and hadn't counted them, so she counted them for him. Irvet Muln approached and sat down beside him, but didn't mention that she had warned him. She said something else. She had brought from the copper house what Krill hadn't taken. Not a book, an inventory of works spanning 400 years. She read it all night, finished it, and said 3 things, and all 3 fell into place like the final stones in a masonry wall. First, the mass had always devoured people, devouring them from the very beginning, and the bone was merely in between. Second, none of the 218 were dangerous before the hoop. 80 of them had no branch at all and were simply debtors, the sick, and the surplus, and they were taken because weight was needed. Third, and most important, first, 400 years ago in the lower city, there lived a man with the same branch as Dargan, and he ate nothing. He hauled stone and built arches, and they called him a builder. They took him, clad him in copper, and bound him in shackles. A year later, he ceased to be human, went up to the upper city, and devoured lower Tarnhall. The order was founded after that. For 400 years, the order fought against what it had created itself, and it did so in the same way each time, and that method gave birth to the next one every time. Dargan listened and stared into the chasm. He asked her directly what happens to a carrier at the 100 mark if there is no hoop on it. Irvet Muln replied that there had not been a single recorded instance of such a case in 400 years. He stood up and hovered over the chasm, counting calmly for the last time. You cannot break the mass because it is the entire support. You cannot starve the mass because, when hungry, it rises. You cannot burn the mass with lime because the lime removes the crust. The mass is a bone. A bone doesn't respond to a voice. A bone responds to a grip. He cannot grasp it because the grip calculates weight, and its limit is his own threshold. So there is exactly one way, and he had known that way from the moment he read the first line of the brand in the darkness of the ossuary. To take it by grip, he had to stop being the person holding the bone and become the bone that holds. Naira erased 62 from the board and wrote nothing. She said she wouldn't try to talk him out of it. She said she'd buried her brother 2 weeks ago and that she'd had enough. And then she said she'd go down with him and that it wasn't up for discussion. An hour later, a boy came running from the north gate. Oswin Kryl had sent neither a letter nor a demand. He had sent a location. He was at the foot of the hill, right by the mass, with the last 30 servants, a book, and 200 people rounded up during the week of the purge. He was driving them down into the lower gallery. The boy relayed, word for word, a single phrase that he had been ordered to convey to the hearth from the ossuary. Kryl had instructed him to say that he was granting the city 3 days of peace, and that in those 3 days he would have time to inscribe the 220th name. 29 people went down. Dargan led the way. Naira Skeld carried a plank and had coal strapped to her belt. Raimund Hess was accompanied by 18 of his father's men and held a sword in his right hand because his left could no longer hold it. Irvet Muln carried the keys to all the grates in the copper house. Halvar, with 4 shovelers and ropes. They didn't go through the vent. They went through the collapse in the eastern quarter because the collapse now led straight into Old Tarnhall, and that was 2 hours closer. The first hour passed in silence. The second did not. The spurs stood in the galleries like roots, and they had to make their way through them. Dargan led the way, grabbing hold of them, pulling and tearing. With each one, he lost a piece of his gear and had to piece it back together from what lay at his feet, and there was a great deal lying there. In 2 hours, he had pieced together 6 pieces. Naira wrote on the board and silently showed him the number. 68. 71. The lower gallery was the final bend before the hall. Kryl was holding 200 people there. He kept them in 3 vaulted chambers behind bars, and the bars were locked. The attendants stood not by the bars, but at the far end, where the chambers opened onto a platform leading to the crowd. The plan was simple and contained not a shred of madness. He intended to open the wings one at a time, letting the crowd into them in turn, and stretch out the feeding over 3 days. The brawl on the plaza had been going on for 20 minutes, 30 guards against 29. Jess's men fought worse, but they were led by a man whom the entire city had seen a month ago, standing unarmed in the circle, and who now did not retreat a single step. Ryman Guest took the first grate, and then the second. Ervit Moln unlocked the locks with her keys and shouted at the men in the sleeves to go upstairs and not look back. Dargan held the entrance to the plaza and let no one through, and in the 18th minute, the vault of the lower gallery gave way. It didn't collapse because of the fighting. It collapsed because the eastern quarter had settled on top of it, because the weight had eroded the foundation from the south, and because no one had inspected those arches in 400 years. The rumble was the same as 3 nights ago. About 130 people remained in the gallery. Dargan looked up and saw the line along which the vault would collapse. He saw where it would land and realized it would come down on the entire wing. And he did what he had done his entire short life in this city, and what he had done in another life that he allowed himself to recall in just 2 sentences. He stood beneath it. He unfolded his fans, not as weapons. He raised them upward and braced them against the vault, then lowered his hands to the floor and gathered 4 supports from whatever lay on the platform. He led them from the floor to the vaults and bound them crosswise with ox ribs, shoulder blades, vertebrae, and whatever else was there. He wasn't building armor. He was building a roof. The 4th step held the bone on its own, and for the first time he understood why it had been given to him. The vault settled onto his roof, and the roof sagged half in arshin and stopped. He stood beneath it in the middle, holding the joint that was missing. People walked beneath him. 130 people walked past his feet, and he stared straight ahead, not moving. Naira stood 10 paces away, counting aloud, but she wasn't counting people. She was calculating percentages because he was joining pieces together right there, and Halvar and his laborers were handing them to him. 74, 79, 83. In those moments, he remembered everything he'd allowed himself to forget. He remembered that he was the man who weighed the cargo and signed off on the calculation, that the total was 14 metric tons, and that he'd made a mistake in one number. He remembered that the load had gone down and that there were 4 people below. He remembered that he'd managed to shout, that the shout hadn't changed anything, and that there was nothing after that. He stood beneath the vaulted ceiling of the old city, with 83% bone in his own body, and understood why he'd been given a 0 in reason and hands that hold. This time, no one was left below. Raymond Hess was the last to pass. He walked beneath him, stopped, and Dargan told him to leave. Raymond left. Krayla was found on the plaza right by the mass. He hadn't run. He was sitting on a rock with a book on his lap, looking up at the mass rising up its slope, while his last men stood nearby, unsure of what to do. Dargan stepped out from under his canopy, leaving it standing, and approached him. Krayla was nearly 70. For 30 years, he had read the fates of others aloud in the Order's courtyard. He did not stand up. He said he would neither make excuses nor beg. And he said the rest just as he had read the line on the day of the branding. He said 9 houses in 40 years. That he himself had carved the lines on the seals and himself had marked a 0 in the mind of those he had chosen. That he had always chosen those without a name and without kin, and that this was the only mercy he had allowed himself. He asked Dargan what he would do with 30,000 and with what lay beneath them. He said that if Dargan had another answer, he would listen to it, and that in 40 years, no one had offered him anything else. Dargan replied briefly. He said that there was an answer, and that it was not the city that would settle the score. He took him by the shoulder and handed Hess over to the men alive, ordering them to take him upstairs and hand him over to the debt court. Krail did not resist. He handed over the book himself. Then Dargan stepped out onto the platform alone. The mass was moving upward along its slope and had already reached the balcony, its dry rustling echoing throughout the hall. He stopped 10 paces away and looked at it the way he had looked at the growth on the lower tier 3 months earlier. He searched for a foothold, but there was none. He searched for a root, but there was none. He saw before him 100,000 poods of bone, and realized that it was neither a creature, nor a wall, nor a monster. It was a man who 400 years ago had built the vaults. Naira stood by the exit with a board, and he told her to count aloud. He dropped to his knees and began gathering everything that lay on the landing. For 20 years, 900 poods had been brought here each year. He picked up the pieces and joined them to himself, neither sorting nor counting them himself. 86. 89. The skin on him had worn away in 4 places. He stopped feeling the floor beneath his feet and realized that his feet were no longer his own. 93. He stopped hearing his own breathing. 96. Naira stopped shouting the numbers and began to say them evenly and softly, and she came right up close to him, and he could still hear that. 98. 99. He stopped. He lifted what had been his right hand, reached out toward the mass, and took it. He didn't strike it. He gripped it the way one grips a handle. The brand on his forearm flared from within one last time, and he saw a line that no one before him had ever seen. Step 5. The foundation. The grip does not account for weight. The mass trembled along the entire length of the hall. 100,000 poods of bone recognized the hand and moved beneath it, just as the shackles had moved in the ossuary on that first night. And along with that, a counterforce surged through his own hand. What has fused cannot be removed. What he had taken began to enter him, spreading across the entire area of contact, and it was impossible to stop it. Naira Skeld stood 2 steps away, looking at the number he could no longer read himself. The board read 100. Naira Skeld stood 2 steps away from him, holding the board, and waited. All 218 before him had ceased to exist in this place. In 400 years, the Copper House's records had known only one outcome. He did not stop. He stood on the platform, reduced to bone, not a scrap of flesh remaining of the man he had been, and he thought very clearly, thinking of her and of how she was standing too close. He told her to step back. The voice that came out wasn't his. She took a single step back and no more. The difference lay in one thing, and it was the very difference Ervet Moln had spoken of. Copper. 218 people had reached the end inside the hoop, and the hoop muffled the brand and, along with it, muffled the one who bore it, leaving only their height. He had removed his hoop with lye in the brand maker's vat 6 weeks ago and reached the end unencased, and the brand was with him, and he was with the brand.
The first bearer, 400 years ago, erected arches and was a builder, and knew exactly the same things as he did. They simply placed the copper on him before he had a chance to grasp anything. Dargan held the mass, and the mass flowed into him, and he did not interfere with it. He took it all in. It took a time he did not count, and Naira later said she had stood in the hall for about 2 hours. 100,000 poods entered him, and he didn't budge a finger, because the grip doesn't account for weight, and because he was now not a bearer, but a foundation. And when the last piece entered, he unclenched his hand. He let go. For 400 years, the belief had held that none of the 218 could do this. The mass crumbled. It scattered all at once, all over the hall, throughout the galleries, down the spurs beneath the eastern quarter, and into the wells. It ceased to be a single entity and became what it had always been, a bone. A simple, dry bone that lies there, motionless. A deafening roar filled the hall, along with white dust, and the dust settled for half a day. When the dust settled, Naira walked through the hall with a lantern and began gathering the tokens. There were 218 of them. She found them all. Hyde Gald, number 214. Vesper Gald, unnumbered because his number hadn't been recorded. She recognized him by his tied-up sleeve. Kern Skeld, number 218. She had buried him 2 weeks earlier and had been carrying his token with her ever since. And Orville Holt, number 199. Dargan took that token in his hand and held it, feeling nothing, because he had nothing left with which to feel. He placed it in Naira's palm and said that everyone must be buried, and that this was not a request, but a calculation. He said that in the pit behind the eastern wall, bones were ground into glue, and that if even one of the 218 were put back into circulation, the city would start over in 40 years. Upstairs, the accounts had been settled for 3 weeks. The Tarnhall Debt Court tried Oswin Crail for 8 days before a full house. Taller Gansk read the indictment, citing 4 volumes of the city archives and the Book of the Copper House, which Crail had handed over himself. Crail did not defend himself even once. The verdict was handed down under the very same article he had used to intimidate people in the Order's courtyard for 30 years. The city's burden is sold into the bone pits. He was sold into the pits beyond the wall, and he walked there of his own accord. Dargan did not attend. Irvet Moln was tried next. She admitted to 19 offenses and requested the same sentence for herself. The court refused. The court ordered her to run the Copper House under city supervision for the rest of her life and to keep its records open to the public. She said this was worse than the pits, and stayed. The Copper House ceased to be part of the order. The branding remained because it is not a person who applies the brand. Seals are now cut in the presence of 3 witnesses, and the inventory records are open. Anyone can come and read their own. The Copper Key Guild carries the bone openly, pays the toll, and takes half of its orders from the city for construction. Ansel Hess lost more than half his fortune on the trial and on the restoration of the Eastern Quarter, and he did not regret a single day. Raymond Hess took up guard duty in the 3rd Field, holding his staff with his left hand, which remains clenched, and his sword with his right. He came to Dargan once, right at the very end, and brought a copper coin. That very one. He said he'd picked it up in the Order's courtyard that same evening 3.5 months ago, and had carried it in his pocket without knowing why. He placed it on a stone and left without saying another word. And that was enough. The court ruled the debt owed by the Holt household, 214 crowns, null and void, along with the other 8. Dargan demanded that it be reinstated and paid. Gansk argued with him for 2 evenings and lost. 214 crowns were deposited into the city treasury from his share of the bone retrieved from the Old Town, and Toller Gansk issued him a receipt, affixed the seal, and crossed out a line. Dargan took the paper and held it for a long time. From the very first day, he had been a foreign entity in this city, something that had been pre-registered for someone else. Now he owed nothing to anyone, and no one owed him anything. And the paper stated this in the city's handwriting, bearing the city's seal. He had named the price himself, Nair, that evening by the sinkhole. He doesn't eat, he doesn't drink, he doesn't sleep, doesn't get tired, and doesn't warm himself by any fire. He doesn't age. He can't take her hand in a way that feels like a hand. He told her this straight out and didn't beat around the bush because he'd promised to speak plainly that very evening when they shook hands behind the glue maker's house. Naira Skeld listened and said she'd known for a month and had been waiting for him to figure it out and say it himself. The eastern quarter had sunk 4 arshins, leaving a void 3 streets wide beneath it, a void that could not be filled. The city engineers said the entire quarter would have to be demolished and that it would take 9 years. Dargan went down, looked, and made his calculations. Then he gathered from beneath the 3 streets what hadn't been buried in the graves. He fashioned supports and arches from the simple, dry bones of Old Tarn Hall, tied them together crosswise, and extended the strut toward the cliff on the north side, working at it for 11 days. He wasn't building armor or weapons. He was building a roof over the void. When he finished, he remained beneath it, not as a sacrifice, nor in shackles. He remained because a calculation for 400 years is held not by the vault itself, but by the one standing at the junction, the one who was missing. He had once been the man who calculated the weight, and once he had erred in a single number, and back then there were 4 below. Now there were 30,000 up above, and the number was correct, and he was with them. Naira Skeld digs by the 3rd field and buries her own and strangers there, and she buried 218 in a single fall. She keeps a book. Her book is not like the one the Order had. In the Order's book, they recorded those they had taken. In her book, they record by name those who have been laid to rest. Toller Gansk helps her with her handwriting. Once a year, the eastern quarter takes the lead. The houses creak and the plaster crumbles, and the old people on Kozhevnikov Street tell the young that the foundation is settling. It settles and stops and never collapses. Down below, beneath 3 streets, stands what was once a boy from the city's lowest social class, with a 0 in intelligence, whom the whole courtyard used to laugh at. He has neither a voice, nor warmth, nor a sentence. He has only his hands and what has been placed upon them. He holds it. He owes nothing to anyone, and no one owes him anything anymore.